What made a Disneyland mascot break character? I worked the parade route from time to time, making sure kids didn't dart out in front of floats and such. People like me would often be playful with cast members along the parade route, winking and making silly faces. There was one day where Baloo came up to me mid-dance and proceeded to bow to me. Baloo also happened to be wearing some sort of crown or hat thing with a star on top. Baloo probably wasn't aware of how tall that actually made them. Baloo managed to smack me right in the mouth with that star, cutting it open and giving me a fat lip. Fairly certain I heard Baloo audibly gasp when they stood upright again. Paw to mouth. He immediately stopped dancing, just stared at me as I bled. They tried to grab my hands and pull me to them, but their handler came and ushered them along. Whoops! I auditioned to be a face character, and Disneyland made it to the stage where they run through scenarios of unruly guests, rude comments, etc., and you have to respond and come up with responses in character. My dance teacher was also a face more than 20 years ago, and she had all kinds of stories of people trying to reach up her skirt. She was Pocahontas mainly. In the end, I'm glad I didn't make it through. At the time, it was barely above minimum wage, which was like $6.75 an hour or something like that. I chaperoned a gentleman with special needs to Disneyland as part of a group tour. When our group of special needs individuals met the characters, they were all absolutely incredible with our people. Minnie flirted with my friend I took, Merida flirted with me, but the best of all was Cruella de Vil. Normally, she insults who she takes pictures with. With us, she managed to stay in character but not say anything actually mean. She said to one guy with a cane, "Ah, I like your cane. You can use it to beat the little ones out of your way." Disneyland used to have a Tarzan character, but you don't see him anymore. Since the characters are always expected to pose for photos and selfies, and Tarzan wore nothing but a loincloth, women were just constantly grabbing the character's butt when they got close. So the park just quit that character. After some confirmation of the bad behavior, there are still some recent Tarzan sightings. It appears Disney paused the character and redesigned his loincloth costume into one more like a pair of shorts and a jungle vine sash. Apparently women are still grabby, but the costume department tried to make it a little less easy. If they can't break character, does Rapunzel get to hit the preverts with a frying pan? The narrator has read ahead a little, and after seeing how many stories of people behaving inappropriately with these poor costumed employees there are, I kinda wish that appropriate characters like Rapunzel, Mulan, and Kim Possible, who kick a lot of butt, could in fact do so with full approval from their bosses. On a Disney cruise, I met a guy who looked exactly like Peter Pan. When we asked him, he said, "Nope, Peter Pan has brown eyes," or something like that. The next day, when we went to get a picture with Peter, he got super close and whispered, "See? Peter has brown eyes." Hands down, the best Disney employee I've ever met. This guy played Pluto as well. I watched Jack Sparrow talking to a kid when the kids started chucking up everywhere. Jack then said, "Too much of the old apple juice, eh, mate?" Been there myself. Even ran out once. All the while, the kid was just projectile spewing everywhere. I just want to say that there's a video on YouTube of some meathead trash-talking Gaston about how he could beat him in a push-up match. They go at it, the meathead gives up, and Gaston cranks out a few more one-handed push-ups just to rub it in. Talk about character. A bit late, but I did the college program at Walt Disney World. Never saw a character break when I worked audience control for parades. Definitely saw a few fully costumed characters chuck up in their heads. And Prince Naveen once got heat exhaustion and managed to leave the parade route fully in character. Once the parade was over, we saw him in the back almost completely passed out. Typically, the parade will speed up to double time if a character actor is in distress. I was at Disneyland once, and the Sheriff of Nottingham was fake menacing a child. He reached out to touch the kid's balloon, and for some reason it popped. The character actor was clearly stunned. A new balloon appeared less than 30 seconds later. I remember being in Disneyland Paris when I was 9 and had just gotten a baby Simba plush, which I bought to dinner in one of those character meeting restaurants, where the characters come to your table. Most characters pretended to coo at and tickle Simba. The Sheriff of Nottingham kidnapped Simba. I, of course, got him back. It just took a dramatic fake tug-of-war between Mr. Incredible and the Sheriff of Nottingham to do it. Seriously, these guys are so good at what they do. I saw a recent video on YouTube of Ray talking to this little girl, and her dad just started filming. Apparently, the story the little girl was telling got Ray laughing so hard she had to turn her face away and eventually got up and run away because she couldn't stop laughing at whatever the little girl's story was. Okay, in the comments it's explained and she said, "My daughter busted me out for giving her too many donuts and then told Ray she threw up and then persisted to share how she can potty by herself. Right after sharing Secrets of the Force, a complete 180 in the conversation. That's kids for ya. Super adorable." I have a close friend who was Woody for a while at Disneyland. He said that one time a float caught on fire during the show and they had to play it off completely in character. They danced around it and had to quickly get it backstage to deal with the problem. He said they played it off well enough that no one seemed to notice and there wasn't any panic or stampeding. He said he'd never seen an instance of anyone breaking character because everyone was very well trained and there's always at least 6 or so cameras that you can see at all times. I also one time offered an unopened water bottle to an employee when it was 100 degrees and he said if anyone at Disney saw that, he'd be fired. They can't take anything from guests. He also mentioned the cameras constantly, watching both crew and patrons. One time, an acrobat fell off a float, face planted into the ground, and knocked herself out. They had to surround her in a circle and dance in sync as someone dragged the body away. They played it off very well, and apparently nobody noticed. I've seen articles that face characters can leave at any time if their treatment is bad, using in-character excuses. Costume characters always have an attendant with them to control unruly guests. If you behave like that to a costume character, you deserve to be kicked out of Disney. I worked at the Disney store in late '87 and '88 in Orange County, California. I think at the time it was like one of only a handful of stores open. The back of the store had a big screen where we constantly played some Disney video. Every once in a while, the biggest, muscular, blackest, gayest dude would come in and kindly request we play anything Winnie the Pooh related. He'd then proceed to prance around the store, he came in the evenings towards closing, and sing the Tigger parts of either dialogue or any song. Turns out he was one of the Tiggers at Disneyland. The guy just loved being Tigger. I'm glad that he did. I can't help but think this sounds like a really tough job where you're expected to give 1,000% all of the time for what seems like minimum wage judging by the early stories. I'm happy that some people seem to thrive in the line of work. My cousin used to do this when I was a kid. We'd always go try to find her on days we knew she was working. She mostly played Pooh Bear. She'd never say out loud, "Hi Jill," using my name, but she'd get very animated and jump around to give us hugs. Occasionally she'd still say things like, "Oh, I have a rumbly in my tummy." I thought I was the coolest kid because I knew Pooh Bear. I wasn't a character, but I was a cast member. I was walking from backstage into the park. If you've seen the transitions, they're S-shaped to keep people from peeking in. I was pushing a handcart. The ones we used had 2 long supports sticking out from the end. As I was going through, Winnie the Pooh was walking in from the other side. I hit him or her square in the leg with one of the poles. Hearing Winnie the Pooh say, "Oh, frick," was pretty damn funny. A few days ago, my sister and her friend went to the new Galaxy's Edge area. My sister's friend was about 6'1" and had never seen Star Wars. We were walking around and Chewbacca ran up to her, he was around the same height, and hugged her. Then he put his hand above his head, showing that they were both tall. She was super embarrassed, and while they were walking away, he did that fist pump thing. Since then, we refer to her as Chewbacca's girlfriend. Seriously, the cutest thing ever. I couldn't even get the zombies at Halloween Horror Nights to break character. Asked one where the restroom was and he flung his arms in the proper direction and went, "Ugh." Pretty hilarious. I worked character department at Magic Kingdom many years ago. I can't remember breaking character, but I do remember working the restaurant at the Contemporary for dinners. One time we had a Make-A-Wish kid as a guest, and they were just the most awesome kid, and it was just heartbreaking to know why they were there. So our lead let us do a group hangout with the kid for something like an hour in costume, playing and running around and having fun. You could never play like that in the parks, you'd start a riot. No consequences for us though, we all just hoped that we made the little kid happy. Bonus fun fact, the Goofy costume for the Electric Light Parade was worn by a float driver. And because the driver was seated, there were no pants for that costume, just the glittery top and head and gloves. They do not break character. My best childhood friend is a face character. During the interviews, they bring you through a ton of challenging scenarios, like kids with lost parents, kids who act mean, and if you break character, there's 1,000 other people of your exact height and hair color ready to play the character better than you. They even made my friend do an impression of a Disney character without speaking. She just had to be able to portray the essence of the character, and if they couldn't guess who she wrote down, her interview was over. They're incredibly serious about staying in character. Anytime something bad enough would happen that they should break character, their handler would just guide them away and handle it themselves. Bonus info, she isn't allowed to tell anyone who she plays except family and close friends, or post anything about work on social media for the entirety of her time at Disney, or else she'll be fired. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I worked closely with them as a photographer. Disney performers are trained to never break character for whatever reason. They have ways of signaling their character attendant that they're in distress, and it's generally up to the character attendant to avoid any weird or uncomfortable situations. As far as these weird situations go, they do get people that stalk them in the park, like some people get in line multiple times to get a photo with a specific performer. That weird side of Disney fanatics are something else. Yeah, I heard of one performer who had to get a restraining order after one of her fans got a full back tattoo of her. The tattoo was not of her in character. I don't work for Disney, but I work for Party Princess Productions that does Disney birthday parties on the weekends. I was Darth Vader in Malibu for this kid's birthday. It was only him, which was rare, but we had fun. We played lightsaber hide-and-go-seek, where when he finds me, we duel. I had him practice the Force on me, helping him focus and toss me to the wall. In the middle of all the fun, the kid started coughing. It was subtle at first and then got worse. Got to the point where he's not breathing and he's not moving. I took off my helmet and was about to perform CPR when the mother came out with his inhaler. She told me he can't play anymore because he has bad asthma and it gets worse the more active he is. I put the helmet back on and played things off. We opened presents together and I left. To this day, I hate that mother for watching me play with her kid, knowing his condition and not telling me a word until the poor guy nearly suffocated. I called my boss and told her that I need to know all medical conditions before the party right away from now on. I hope that kid had fun. I still feel horrible for almost killing him from teaching him the ways of the dark side. I wouldn't say break, but I was a lifeguard and I had to ban this kid from going down the water slide. Every single time I told him he had to be feet first, and every time he said, okay, but he kept going head first, and it got to the point where the other kids saw him and were copying him. So I banned him, he left and cried to mum and dad, and I had to explain to them why. They left and cried to my coordinator, and they came back saying it wasn't very magical of me. I explained after several times of this kid not listening, other kids were copying him. In any case, I got a stern talking to about being the nice lifeguard who explains versus the mean lifeguard who just yells orders. Later that day, the kid was running across the deck despite several requests not to, tripped and ate concrete. Oh well, don't hate me because I don't feel bad. Oof. So to stay on topic, I don't know if this is some sort of special lifeguard character that plays at Disneyland or if you just have to maintain a character that feels cartoony. But whether they are caricature or not, listen to your safety officials, people. They're there for a reason. My neighbor, he died a couple of years ago, so I'm safe telling this, worked at Disney for years. One day he was stocking shelves in a gift shop and came around the corner and nearly ran into none other than Paul and Linda McCartney. Before he could stop himself, he loudly exclaimed, "Holy crap, it's the McCartneys!" He immediately realized how big of a breach of Disney cast member etiquette he had committed and turned 12 shades of red, but before anything bad could happen, Paul and Linda just smiled and laughed and introduced themselves. Apparently, they were wonderfully laid back about such things and quite used to surprised reactions when people recognized them in public. He didn't get into any trouble. His boss saw the whole episode and thought it was hilarious. And I think they both signed a hat or something for him while they were checking out. A face performer broke character for my husband and I. I won't say which park, but we took a trip to Disneyland about 2 months after we lost our son. That was our first kid. Our entire nursery was Neverland and Peter Pan themed. We always wanted to take him to Disney, have him meet Peter. Well, he couldn't. I got a memorial tattoo, an exact replica of my son's hospital ink handprint, and we got a picture of Peter Pan with the tattoo. We were alone with him and his handler. I tearfully explained the situation before asking him to pose with my arm. He took lots of photos with my tattoo and us. And afterwards, he hugged me tight, told me he was proud of me and God bless us, and he was so sorry for our loss. It was amazing, emotional, and I'll never forget that Peter Pan was proud of me for finding the strength to keep on living. It honestly meant the world. I'm so glad he broke character. I'll always treasure those photos and that memory. One of the traditions of our college sorority back in the 80s was that the day after initiation, all the new members and their big sisters would go to Disneyland, sporting their new letters to wear. One of the costumed characters in the parade kept throwing gang signs or something at us, and we were so confused. Turns out it was one of our sisters who had to work that day. She was trying to do our sorority's hand symbol, but with her hands in oversized furry gloves, it didn't show up so well. My wife was goofy for a semester in college. She accidentally ripped the feeding tube out of a Make-A-Wish kid in a wheelchair, going in for a hug with poor visibility from the costume. Luckily, all wandering costumed characters have uniformed handlers to assist, but it's kind of hard to stay in character as Goofy after something like that. She felt terrible and was traumatized for weeks. The kid was fine, at least from that incident. It was a hassle to mitigate, but no medical damage resulted from it. I went once, and a man was getting handsy with Cinderella, so she excused herself to the bathroom and ran to a security guard. When I was 6 or so, I went to Disney World with my mum and aunt and cousins. I really wanted Captain Hook's autograph, but per his character, he wasn't supposed to give it. I started crying over it, and my mum went and asked him again, nicely I hope, and told him I was very upset over it. He signed my book even though he wasn't supposed to, and I always thought that was neat. So, to Captain Hook from 1989 or so, if you're out there, thanks, and I hope you didn't get in trouble for that. They don't break character. If a nuke fell on Disney, they'd be ushering you into the bomb shelters as Aladdin or whoever they were playing at the time. More than 10 years ago, my friend was a face character at Disneyland and told me about her friend who was friends with Goofy, which is what you say to people when you're out of costume to preserve the magic instead of outright saying that you are the character. Allegedly, one day, when Goofy's shift was over, he was trying to walk to the back area to cool off when a very angry mum started yelling at him because he ignored her son. In reality, he couldn't see them as he turned to walk away. The lady then called him a racist and said that Goofy was ignoring them because they were black. Goofy turned around to greet the child and signed his autograph book, then he turned to the mum and slipped up his sleeve to quickly point out his own black skin underneath before walking away. A few people have commented to say that this isn't how the costume works, and that the sleeves aren't possible to pull up from under the gloves. It could be a baloney story, but this is just what I heard from my friend who worked full-time at Disney, alongside a bunch of our other classmates from our performing arts school at the time. I was at Disneyland a couple of weeks ago, and I saw Darth Vader not cutting down younglings. It was just unprofessional as all hell. Frankly, the narrator hates all parts of Star Wars that aren't that one exact scene, which I have playing on repeat on my TV after a hard day at work, so character or not, I can understand your frustration. The type of people that play characters are very into it. If something comes up that needs to be addressed, they'll handle it in character. You've probably heard stories about characters helping kids find their parents. These days, characters always have handlers nearby that have walkie-talkies. On the Halloween night, I've seen 2 female employees working the store, not characters, clearly upset by some kind of superior order. The exact dialogue was, "Yeah, sometimes it gets hard. I know it does, but that kind of attitude is unacceptable." I couldn't resist, and I said, "I guess even in Disney, working sometimes sucks." The first girl immediately stood up and smiled as brightly as she could. "What do you mean? Working here is awesome every time." I couldn't help but feel she was agreeing with me, but never breaking the Happy Land face. This place has a dark side. My mum was a costumed character for a couple of years at Disneyland. She was very committed to keeping character, but there was one instance where she broke. 2 teens jumped her when she was playing Piglet and started attacking her. At first, she just tried to block and defend herself, but at one point she kicked one of the boys to the ground and pinned him. Considering she's 4'10" and was wearing a 50-pound costume, I consider that fairly impressive. The other kid continued attacking her, and I think she might have yelped or cried out because the kid she had pinned heard her and said, "Oh crap, it's a chick!" Like, no crap, dumb frick. Most of the shorter characters are women because, well, they're shorter. Cast members came to help her, and the kids were banned from the park. My mum got in a lot of trouble for that too though because she broke character. If I recall correctly, she was suspended for a couple of days. My family went to Disneyland a few times when I was a kid. My dad was just the worst parent, physically and verbally. We left him when I was 12. He was awful on vacations for just being miserable in general. It was Valentine's Day and my mum, dad, older sister and I were at one of the parks. I don't remember which one. All the characters had big red hearts on a string around their necks. My sister was, at oldest, 8 and I would have been 6. We'd just gotten ice cream and my sister and I were excitedly looking around for our favorite characters. My sister just saw Eeyore, her all-time favorite character, so she turned around and my dad, not paying attention, ran right into my sister, holding her ice cream cone and got it on his shirt. He was, to put it lightly, not very happy. She starts crying as my mum starts giving him crap while he defended his actions, saying that his daughter should have watched where she was going. The next thing we know is my sister's being hugged by Eeyore. It shocked her out of crying and she was so incredibly happy because it's Eeyore. Eeyore just kept hugging her while my mum started taking pictures. Eeyore stopped hugging my sister only to point to his paper heart, then to her. Then he hugged her again. There's a picture somewhere in my mum's basement of my sister and I standing with Eeyore, and my sister's beaming but clearly looking like she had just been crying. I still think about Eeyore to this day and wondered what they were thinking. It was the early 90s when people were still largely expected to mind their business when it came to such things. And reading these other comments make me realize he may not have been able to do anything else anyway, but I appreciate his gesture nonetheless. Did someone you know go out to buy cigarettes and then abandon their family? My daughter's mother unexpectedly fell pregnant. I hate the unexpectedly fell pregnant bit, but it's less complicated to say it that way. We weren't together long before, 8 months or so. We'd talked a lot about going traveling. She had done a little and wanted to take me to see all those cool places she had been, and we'd both go to see some new cool places together. Becoming a mother pretty much seemed like it was the end of the world for her. I tried to be optimistic, tried making up stories of how we'd be cool parents who traveled the world with our kid, and our kid would grow up with massively broad horizons. I don't know if she ever believed that could be a possibility, but eventually our daughter was born. Even now I don't know how to portray my daughter's mother as someone who just abandoned their child, but I'll cut it down a bit. There was no motherly instinct in her. Whether it wasn't there or she just didn't want to be a mother, I don't know. She had her life planned out and a baby messed it all up. After about 4 or 5 months of heartbreakingly never seeing any love for our daughter, I gave her the ouch she wanted. I said, "If you can't or won't be a mother, you know where the fricking door is." Within an hour she had packed, called her sister to pick her up, and she left. At first it was tough to find a rhythm to our lives, but I have some good family who helped me a lot. I grew up the youngest of 4 boys, and I know nothing at all about little girls. At the beginning, every couple of months or so, I sent messages, emails, or Facebook messages. In 3 years, I never received a reply, not a word from her since the week she left. Eventually, I deleted her from my Facebook. After weeks of hurting and hoping she'd reply, her sister showed me a message telling her she wished I'd stop sending the messages. She said she just wants to forget it. It being her daughter. She often referred to her as it when she was pregnant since we avoided knowing the gender and even a few times when she was born until I flipped my crap about it. My daughter is 7 now and is happy and loved. I've kind of always skirted around the subject of mum with her. I went with the story that mummy lives far, far, far away and she wanted you to live here with me where you'd be loved and safe, which appeases her, among a few other fairy tale stories I told her like mummy is a fairy. She's pretty happy-go-lucky, which I hope she never grows out of, but there's going to come a time when she's going to want to know more. Incredibly tempting to go down the road of your mum's a selfish C-word, but that won't happen. About a year ago, I came to find out she has a little brother in either America or Canada now with a guy she met in New Zealand. I don't know what to think about that. I don't know whether it's karma or irony. Before I met her mum, I was a bit of a jerk, irresponsible, quick to run if the going got tough. In some respects, I can understand why she left and why others leave their kids. I was there, willing to change my plans for a child that she didn't want in that life. I gave her the option. I don't resent her taking it, but I'll always resent wanting to forget, though. My daughter's mother wanted to spend her life traveling rather than being a mother. Not mad at her, I'm doing as well as I can. Way to step up, my man. It's amazing the ways different parents can respond to the responsibility of parenthood. I've heard that some parents who initially feel nothing eventually grow into it, so maybe the mother should have stuck around, but at least this girl has one loving parent. My grandfather, who I've never met, walked out on my dad. I never really knew anything about him other than that he lived in Florida and chose favorites to the extreme. My dad has 9 brothers and sisters he left behind with my amazing grandmother, Rose. Who I call my grandfather is another amazing person named Jim. Jim worked at a casket company and listened to my grandmother's story one day at the bake shop, I think. After hearing it, he would send check after check to my grandmother offering to help, which my grandmother would never cash and just let build up. When he realized he wasn't losing any money from his bank account, he showed up at my grandmother's doorstep with another check and talked to her. He lived with her after that day until the day she sadly died. Jim is 90 years old and still kicking it. I love that man more than I can express in words. He took in 10 kids? My God, that man is a freaking saint. On my 6th birthday party, my birth mother packed up at the house and took me, my brother and sister a few states away to stay with her brother. When we finally came back, we were living with her family and got to visit my dad in our old house. Seeing the small table and the thrown-in furniture used to resemble a memory of a house is still burnt into my soul, especially the image of my heartbroken dad sitting alone at the table when we left. The more I learn and look back at how my dad handled my birth mother being the worst of people, the more I love and appreciate him. Sucks that I spent so much time fighting with him growing up. I'm just looking around this group of stories to see if my dad's here, because I'd really like to hear his explanation. My real grandfather was a piece of work. I wouldn't say that he was a terrible person, but he was rough. He left my grandmother in the 50s with 5 kids and nothing. I know there are stories about him messing around during World War II with every woman he could find, and that there are probably a lot of half-siblings out there that nobody knows about. Well, I know my mum said they were all so poor growing up because the only income they had was their mum, my grandmother, doing things like secretarial work. The man I call Grandpa found her, loved her, and married her, and ended up with 5 kids because of it. And as a kid, I never even knew until I was older that he wasn't my real grandpa. He was the one who read stories with me. He actually read Harry Potter as an old man because he knew I'd read it and wanted to be able to talk to me about it. And he's the one who always had the Werther's candy for me. I loved that man. I miss him a lot now that he's gone. He's my reminder that anything can make a family as long as everyone cares about each other. No blood relations need be involved. Meanwhile, the only thing my real grandfather ever gave me was a washer and a dryer that are from the 90s that I brought after he died from his tiny little dirty trailer. I needed a washer and dryer, and my mum desperately needed to sell the stuff to have money to pay for his funeral. There's a lesson in this somewhere for people. My real grandpa married and divorced and remarried again and again. In the end, he died sad and lonely and angry with the world all by himself in a dirty little trailer. The man we call my grandpa died surrounded by his adopted family and his wife and even grandkids, who all loved him and mourned his loss something fierce. Whilst my parents divorced when I was 4, and possibly one of my earliest memories was my dad and his guitar case walking out of the first home I knew, this story is someone else's. I did a 6-month stint as a credit and debit card call center goon leading up to the end of last year. I enjoyed it, and as much of a cynical jerk as I may be, I love helping people. This particular one will stay with me forever. A woman called up asking me to update her title. It was listed as Mrs., and she informed me that she had been divorced some time ago. I offered my condolences and she stuttered somewhat, but thanked me, saying it was for the best. After a little bit of conversing, she ended up spilling her guts to me, and explained that her husband had just up and ditched her and their son on frickin' Christmas Eve. Just up and left without a word after 20-ish years of marriage. She had done some digging and he was in Southeast Asia doing a bunch of working girls and a whole load of substances at the same time. After revealing this to her son, the son started acting out, and I related to this. It kind of hit home, and I said that from my experience, he was 20 and I was the result of my dad walking, that the rebellion is anger and to not hate him for it. Just support and love him and give him the option of contact with his father. And so on and so forth. She was in tears by the end, apologizing profusely for going on a tangent and that it probably wasn't my job to deal with her crap. To which I replied, "You're a person before you're a customer, and sometimes we all just need someone to listen." She felt a lot better and went on her way, but ended the conversation saying she wished she'd never searched for her ex, as the truth hurt more than not knowing. People leave because of many reasons. Let them, lest you end up hurting yourself more. My mother went on a trip when I was 7. I remember asking my dad when she was coming back. She got in touch a few years after that, but it still hurt having to learn that she lied to me. I still don't have many good feelings about her. It's probably because I never really knew how to trust her after that. She still believes that she can have a big say in my life even after she left, even though she never helps my father with any bills. She acts like nothing ever happened, like she didn't betray my father and abandon me, and my brother, who was 4 at the time. She still tries to act like the doting mother by promising to help my father, but conveniently forgets to send money. And when she does send some cash, she never lets us forget it. I didn't just take off and leave. We both knew I was heading to another state to live for the remainder of our son's life. I set up child support before I left and have had my son every summer since I left. I decided to leave because I was too immature to raise him to be a functioning member of society. I messed up my life before he was even born, and I didn't want him to follow me down that path. 16 years later, he now has a stable life with a brother and sister that he cares about. I'm very proud of everything they've accomplished. I took the easy way out and just ran away. Someday I'll sit him down and explain everything, but it might be too late. Admitting that you were in the wrong doesn't make this okay, but at least you owned it. It doesn't look like you had another family afterwards, so maybe you learned from your mistakes. I was the one who left. My mother wasn't the world's worst, but the substances were starting to become a major issue. My father had already left, and we saw him about once every couple of months. My mum always had a new boyfriend, and it was never a good one. I was growing very sick of the situation, and I knew that I had to get out of it. The only problem was that my little sister was stuck in the same boat. I was 11 and she was 3. In the middle of the night, I grabbed my little sister, a backpack of clothes for both of us, and my bicycle. I rode until I reached my grandma's house. It wasn't too far, about 25 miles. It felt like it took forever. My grandma took us in, and that's where we stayed. It's not that we didn't have a grandma before, but my mum had always refused to get treatment and accept help. My grandma would offer, my mum would get angry, and we'd be back out the door. This time was different. My grandma changed the locks in the morning. Mum was too hopped up on the substances and didn't wake up until around noon. Plenty of time to get things done. My grandma set up a bedroom for both of us, and when my mum finally woke that morning, she broke down. It was like she finally realized that something had to change. She finally entered treatment. Fast forward 18 years, my wonderful grandparents have passed away, but I have a respectable relationship with my mum. She's clean and runs her own cleaning business that makes ends meet. She just received her GED. My little sister is a semester away from graduating college, and she was the second person in my family to ever graduate high school. I was the first. I got an athletic scholarship and went to college. 2 master's degrees and a job, brand new house, and 2 awesome dogs later, and I'm the happiest guy in the world. I'm a teacher, and my experience has been what led to my success. I share pieces of it with my students, behavioral disorders, to let them know that everyone has a chance. Sometimes you just have to take it. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. My dad walked out on my family when I was about 4 years old. He left us for a woman who he'd been sleeping with to get crystal. I grew up hearing constant fighting in my house, but I remember that day. My mother sounded more terrified and desperate than I'd ever heard her before. I was sitting behind a chair in the living room, and I remember not liking how cold it was. Slamming doors, screaming. They came out and my dad just said he was leaving. I ran to him because I wanted to go too. He literally shut the door in my face and left. I remember the worst part about it was my mum sitting on the floor, sobbing. I sat on her lap and told her, "It'll be okay, Mummy. I love you." Seriously, I've always wanted to just shut that memory out. Blech. My grandfather left my dad and his family on my dad's first birthday. So now my dad hates his birthday and his family kinda hates him because they feel like it was his fault or something. My dad ended up getting an awesome stepdad and kept some contact with his biological dad. Both of them died within a few months of each other a few years ago. There was no funeral for my biological grandfather. My dad wasn't sad at all. When his stepdad died, though, he gave the eulogy, and it's the only time I've ever seen my dad cry. My grandfather went out while my grandmother was in labor, and he never came back. She sent the cops looking for him and everything, and when they went to her house, he had left a note saying he got his secretary pregnant and he was leaving. He left her with no money, 4 kids, and having never worked in her life. My dad was the one she was giving birth to. He never met his father until he was called to my grandfather's deathbed a few years ago. When my dad walked into that hospital to see him, the witch who he had cheated with stepped in front of my dad before he went into the room, saying, "You aren't getting any money." My dad said, "Shut up. I just want to meet my father." She stepped aside. We walked in, and the old man saw us. His face changed expressions from plain to absolute terror. He began sobbing. Sobbing. How could he know it was his son, you ask? Because they looked like fricking identical twins. He barely sobbed out the words, "You look just like me." He tried to say, "I'm sorry," but my dad interrupted, saying, "I forgive you." This sounds like a scene from a movie, but it is the most precious memory I have of my dad. I've never seen my dad the same way again. He's my personal hero. How could he just forgive him? My dad never had a Christmas because of how poor they were. He did Boy Scouts alone? Alone. I just don't know how he forgave him. I don't get it. I can tell you how, because it's something I figured out maybe 5 years ago after dealing with an unresolved anger over my wife leaving me for one of my supposed best friends. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not the person you're forgiving. Holding on to all that anger and pain just eats you up and rips your soul apart. Once you forgive the person, you start to heal the damage. Until then, it's just a scab over a festering wound. My father moved out when I was 7. He was going to visit his sick father, which might have been partially true as my grandfather on his side was sick and ended up passing away around that time. I was just really confused why my mother was crying when he said he was going to visit my grandpa. I found out why when he didn't come back. Last time I heard from him, he called me on my 9th birthday to tell me he wasn't going to pick me up that Friday, for the weekends at his place that we usually have, because he was going to find a new house to live in and didn't want to bore me with paperwork. Anyway, I've never heard from him again. I wanted to comment because something actually happened regarding my father around 2 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, a co-worker at my restaurant pulled me aside and told me she saw a guy with my last name who looked like me. My co-worker said he had asked the guy if he had a son named my name, and the man said he did, but he hadn't seen him in a long time. I kinda blew it off as a coincidence, but 2 weeks ago, the co-worker pulled me aside again and said the guy came back with a business card, asking to give the card to me, since he knew my co-worker worked with me. It was him. So now I have my father's cell number, work address, work numbers, and email. I'm not really sure if I'm going to call or email or not. He has the same handwriting as me. My mother was a working girl, alcoholic, and addicted to substances. She left when I was 3 and never came back. My father would tell me that she loved me very much but just wasn't ready or mature enough to have a child. He passed away when I was 16. When that happened, I was able to get in contact with my mother's sister, an aunt to me. She would hang out with me, but when I asked around my mother, she would beat around the bush and say that my mum didn't want me to see her the way she was. I hoped to graduate college and then see my mother to show her that I did good and be able to talk to her as an adult, but she died right before I turned 22. So I never got to ask her why, but it's easy enough to assume that when the party lifestyle has its hooks in you, those hooks are deep indeed and never really let go. This is a really sad story. I guess the best thing a person can do in this kind of situation is live long, live well, and use their experiences to make sure that their future loved ones never have any of the same questions growing up. My mum didn't really follow the gonna get SIGs, be right back route. It was made very clear she was leaving because she was a mum and felt like my siblings and I robbed her of her youth. With that being said, I was 8 years old when it happened. There were warning signs that she was going down that path. She stopped taking care of her kids. We stopped going to school. For me, I was being bullied and it was better to not go than to go and be made a laughingstock. She stopped making food. She'd give us money to go to the convenience store or pork out on Twinkies or something junk food related. My dad was never home because he was working at a prison and often would pull long shifts, which actually gave my mum time to plan her escape. The internet was starting to become a big thing, so my mum was using it as a tool to find single, younger men and to get them to bring her youth back. She was in her early 30s. Anyway, eventually my dad got wind of something going on. It was actually the school that made him realize something was amiss. My mum didn't care about us not going to school, but made clear that should we leave and wander the neighborhood, we should run from people who would recognize us. Well, the principal went to see why we weren't in school. My mum apparently said we were at the park, and the principal, a really sweet lady, went looking. Sure enough, we were playing on the jungle gym, and my dad was called. Once that happened, the next thing I know, my mum was leaving. I remember I was in tears, and I just knew that I wasn't going to see her again. And I was right. 12 years went by. I went from depressed to resentful to accepting what had happened. I talked to her on Skype once, but that was really it. My grandmother had raised me, and when I turned 14, I immigrated to Canada, where I now reside. November of the 12th year she abandoned me, I found out she was dying of cancer and it was only a matter of weeks before she would die. I hopped on a plane with my ex's mum and I saw her. She was 42 when I saw her, and she looked like she was 70. Anyway, I spent a good 5 days with her. We didn't talk much. I was comforted by her presence and she was comforted by mine. It broke my heart to leave her, but I had to go back to work. I'll never forget 3 things though. 1, she said I love you for the very first time. 2, she endured great physical pain to get downstairs to say goodbye to me, and finally, how she begged me not to leave her. She died not even a week after I got back. I'll always remember the time I spent with her as an adult and cherish that. I didn't go to see her to make things right or whatever. I'd learned by that point she had made mistakes, and dwelling on the why of it all was getting me nowhere. She left me as a sickly, soft-spoken, crying little girl and saw me for the first time before she died as a healthy, strong-willed adult. I got a package from my stepdad about a month later. Inside was a pearl necklace that I wear every day, and a picture of me from when I was 8 years old. With it, there was a small note about how she kept that picture with her all the time and would often wonder about me. My siblings had reached out to her, but I never did. She had recent pictures of them, but just this one tattered old photograph of me. It made me cry. I know that this was a long story, so I'll end it and say that in her case, she may have made some horrific mistakes, but in the end, she would have done anything to change what she did. But I also know that she needed to leave because she was ruining the lives of my siblings and I. I love my mum, and I always will. My cousin from an extended part of my family decided to disappear. At least, that's what my family tells me. In the late 90s and noughties, I spent a lot of time with him and his family in Greenville, South Carolina. They would also come up to North Carolina to visit us. I would like to think I was the closest person to him from the North Carolina side of the family. He's 1 year older than me and should be turning 25 or so soon. All was fine until his mother was diagnosed with a terminal illness. She fought for years and was as hard-nosed a fighter as I've ever seen. During this fight, his dad was diagnosed with lung cancer and died relatively soon afterwards. Eventually, his mother passed away as well, and my cousin was essentially on his own. My side of the family tried to keep in touch, and they thought of all people, I'd be the one he'd reach out to. I haven't heard from him since 2009, when I believe he was selling real estate in South Carolina. I've tried all social media to find him. I'm fairly certain he just wants to disappear. It worries me though, because what if that wasn't the case? I mean, I can definitely see that being his personality, but you never know. I know I've gone on a little rant here, but I knew him and his friends pretty well. I know they're the kind of people who are on Reddit. Surely one of them, and maybe even my cousin, will see this and know with certainty who I'm talking about. Chris, you don't have to get in touch or even have a friend let me know you're alright. I just wanted to let you know I've not forgotten about you and I miss you. Emergency service workers. When have you laughed when you really shouldn't have? I used to work in an adult and pediatric emergency department as a scribe. I followed a doctor, NP, or a PA and wrote their charts. One time a patient came in for downstairs injury to her girl bits. So the PA I was assigned to, who's my father's age, says, that'll be interesting, and we go in. The lady is very friendly, bubbly, overweight, with long, fake nails. He asks her what brings her to the ED, and she says, well, you see, I just got my nails done, and I was having fun and really going to town down there, and it felt really good, and I scratched my hoo-ha. She laughed awkwardly, and I couldn't handle myself and had to leave. The PA kept himself together and told the patient I left because my job was over, as I wrote down her complaint. But honestly, I was crying in the hallway with another tech who overheard. The door was shut, but she was loud and proud and the unit was quiet. I scratched my hoo-ha became a response to "What's up?" at my hospital for a bit. During my EMT basic clinical rotations, my buddy Greg and I are working in an emergency room trying to do as many ECGs as possible, so that we could check that off our list of clinical skills that we needed to do. Greg is hooking up an absolutely enormous woman to ECG leads. To accomplish this, he indicates to her that he'll have to move her left melon to gain access to her chest wall. I'm not exaggerating when I say that she weighed 400 pounds. One of her heaping bosoms probably weighed a solid 40 pounds by itself. So Greg, using the back of his forearm, is pushing aside her left chest. Or trying to, and failing. So he's basically rubbing her left chesticle with his forearm, trying to get it out of the way. His face, meanwhile, is about 12 inches from her face. She leans closer to Greg, moans, and says, "Oh, you like that, don't you?" And I have to leave. I admitted a patient to a surgical floor who had a baton stuck up his butt. When getting to the report, I couldn't help but chuckle. It was the first time I'd dealt with someone who had a foreign object where it shouldn't have been. The worst part was when I showed him the intraoperative pictures of them removing it, he asked the surgeon where the glitter went. Oh, don't worry. He'll keep finding glitter for years. It never goes away. Once again, doing videos on medical cases, the narrator prepares for the deluge of completely innocent men who seem to fall exactly onto cylindrical objects butt first after their pants fell off. The only thing different about this story is the absence of the words, "I tripped and fell." In fact, this gentleman seems to own it. I work as an X-ray tech in a heavily Hispanic area in the US. I don't know a lot of Spanish, but I know just enough to get by. We get this patient in the ER, and there are 3 of us trying to fumble our way through this exam in our broken Spanish. We eventually get through the exam, and we're all kind of congratulating each other on knowing just enough Spanish. Then, out of the middle of nowhere, this guy says, "You know, you guys speak pretty good Spanish." In perfect English. I guess none of us decided to ask if he spoke English. Similar story. I walked in to perform an exam and the patient is just observing me. I said, "Hi sir, I'm blah blah blah. I'm here to do blah blah blah. How's your day going?" No response. "Can you hear me?" Now I'm thinking that he's not a native or a psych patient. Habla inglés? The patient says, "Do I look like a freaking wetback?" I was holding inside my laughter as I said, no. He was a regular, no tattoos Hispanic male with a mustache with a tanned complexion. He looked like Pedro from Napoleon Dynamite. Yeah, he did look like an immigrant that crossed a river. Was an EMT. My partner was doing a head-to-toe on a little old lady that fell at a nursing home. She gets to the patient's left hip, squeezes it and says, "Ma'am, do you know how long you've had this growth on your hip?" Little old lady replies in a TV-worthy Boston Brahmin accent, "That's my chest, dear." Gave myself a bloody nose when I tried to hide my laughter by shoving my face into the oxygen bag and smacking it on the tank. Super busy day on the oncology floor, short-staffed, and I had 6 patients and was in charge. Literally running up and down the halls, no lunch. A patient passed away peacefully. I call next of kin to notify. I stay on the phone to offer condolences and they were speechless. The conversation is weird, so I call the next number on the list, and that call was okay. Turns out I dialed a wrong number, but the wrong number also had a family member in the same hospital. 30 minutes later, the wrong number lady rushes into the unit and asks about the death in room 417. Wasn't a dead patient, by the way. I immediately get drenched in sweat and tell her my error. I got woozy and dizzy. She props me up and started making jokes. We ended up hugging and laughing. She brought me lunch and a card the next week, and I smile every time I think of her. She made my screw-up livable. I had a patient who was high on some intense cocktail of substances. We found him jumping from couch to couch in a lobby covered in freshly cut hair that wasn't his. We finally get him to the ambulance, but he proceeded to scream at my partner, "You have beautiful eyes. I'm gonna F you in the butt." And then he begins to cry for his mother. We make it to the hospital and the patient's vocabulary decreases to only meatballs. Every question the nurse asks, that was his response. We try to remain professional as possible, but sometimes you can't help but laugh. Damn it, he stole my pickup line. Responded to a fatal fire. When I arrived on scene and went to where the body was located, the trooper introduced me to the deceased. The trooper said, where are my manners? Meet Frank, deceased. Say hello, Frank. As you can see, he had a late night of drinking and a bad case of setting himself on fire. Laughing in front of a dead guy who set himself on fire is not one of my strong moments. Ex-firefighter here responded to a rollover with persons trapped inside. It turned out to be a car versus train. Got the front wheels stuck on the tracks. I have no clue how. It was a regular road crossing, so the train is barreling down, blaring horn clips, and flips the car into the ditch. The driver was trapped. My partner, instead of the usual, "Hi ma'am, where are you hurt?" etc., said to the driver, "Did you crap your pants?" One of my friends was an EMT, and he responded to a call from a guy who got attacked by his cat. Turns out the guy tried to do the deed with his cat, and the cat wasn't having any of it. My friend said that was the only time he and his partner laughed in a client's face. So I was riding along with my dad, who was a firefighter and paramedic, and we went to the house for a mentally handicapped female who had fallen and couldn't get up. I should mention that this female lives with her husband, who is also mentally handicapped, and they have a caretaker who checks in on them daily but doesn't hang around 24/7. Anyway, so he sat her up and my dad asks his other medic to run out to the ambulance to grab an extra cold compress to put on her head, where she fell, but she says there's an ice pack in her freezer that will work just fine in the next room. Well, the other medic goes into the other room and looks for about 2 minutes before coming back with a bag of frozen vegetables that would work as well. The mentally handicapped lady looks him straight in the face and says, "That's not a cold pack, those are vegetables. Are you retarded?" In short, paramedic got called retarded by a mentally handicapped woman. I feel like that's one of the few people who could get away with using that insult. Also, how do you respond when she calls you that? Pretty damn funny. This happened to me once, at a grocery store when the new tap-to-pay cards came out. I'd never used it, so I quickly tapped it, and it didn't register as you had to hold it there for a few seconds. The mentally challenged bag boy said, "Is this guy retarded?" to the cashier. I wasn't sure if I should laugh or cry. I was administering IV push meds to a patient. Their guest was German and asks me with a giant smile, "Are those the Woodstock substances that make him super happy hippo, yeah?" I fricking lost it. Patient who was in police custody and out of his mind on some substance or other. A nurse entered to use a catheter to get a urine sample for the analysis, and in the process of doing that, the patient screams, "It feels like a fly is doing the deed with my wang." Also, an older guy who may or may not have been there mentally gave me a lecture on how he knew I was a liar because my lips were moving. I had to step out of the room to laugh. Sort of reverse here. During my rotations at a university medical center, I was shadowing an RN when we went to help a patient who was paralyzed from the waist down from a motorcycle accident. Keep in mind, this patient was big, probably 300 pounds, and he couldn't go number 2 by himself anymore. Therefore, the RN put on rock music, snapped on some gloves, and proceeded to joke with the patient. We had to push down on his stomach while digitally activating his butt to make the brown stuff come out. I swear about a gallon of it burst forth, and the nurse told me it was the biggest code brown he had ever seen. Making jokes and laughing with the patient made it extremely comfortable and a fun experience. 10 out of 10 would stick my finger up a butt again. I had a 95-year-old nurse crap on my hand once. We both laughed. I answered a fire alarm at a hotel room once. I knocked on the door and a rail-thin, 90-pound-ish woman answered the door in nothing but a t-shirt. I told her that we need to have access to the hotel room just to verify that there wasn't an issue. I walk in and immediately see a 300-pound, mid-50s guy, the woman was in her 30s, totally undressed and handcuffed to the bed. Alright, whatever. Standard question, do you know how the alarm was set off? Oh, yeah, I accidentally hit it when I threw his boxer shorts. Alright, ma'am, have a nice night. Cue hilarious laughter from the stairwell back to the firehouse. How do boxers set off a fire alarm? If you throw something at an electric firearm, like a smokehead or something, it can set it off. Same thing happens with CO alarms. If you dropped it or knocked into it, or apparently throw boxes at it, it can set it off. This wasn't a sprinkler head, or I'd have felt far worse for the guy handcuffed to the bed because he would have taken it all. I was an intern firefighter back when I was in college, and we received this distress call from a senior home one day. Apparently there was an old lady about 70 to 75 years old who was really drunk, and she broke her hip walking through the hallway. When we got there, she was on the ground covered in her own number 2. The thing I laughed at was what she was saying while she was on the ground. The old lady said, "Get the frick off me!" The captain said, "Ma'am, you need to hold still while the ambulance comes." Hey, Oscar," referring to her housekeeper. "Is that you?" "Yes, ma'am, Oscar is right here." "Well, F you, Oscar." Advanced emergency medical technician working a standby at one of our many nightclubs a couple of summers ago. I came back from handing over a transport to find a man with a hole in the front of his jeans all covered in blood. He was sitting calmly next to his friend, joking and having a good time. I ask him what's going on, and he admits to drinking and taking quite a bit of white snow. He states that he's not in any pain but worried about all the blood. We expose his nether regions to find out that he had apparently impaled his ball bag on the cleat of a pool umbrella and now had one of his family jewels protruding from said hole. His very British friend saw what happened and yelled, "Bollocks, me mate, your bean is out the bag." I had to excuse myself for a minute. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I had a gentleman unalive himself by placing a clear plastic bag over his head and running a line from a helium tank. Apparently, it's one of the least painful ways to go. You just get sleepy and pass out. No oxygen starvation. Anyways, me and my partner are waiting for the deputy since it's clear he's been dead a while. We start talking in the bathroom with the body. So, what do you think his last words were? "Ahoy! Goodbye, world!" Said in a Mickey Mouse voice, of course. I'll never forget that I had hiccups for 2 hours after we got done laughing our butts off. The report and dealing with the family was super awkward. Had a pregnant lady about to pop and brought her upstairs. The L&D nurses at this facility were pretty snobby and always seemed to have an attitude problem. I gave them my report and told them that according to my assessment, they needed to prep for delivery ASAP. The charge nurse rolled her eyes at me and began condescendingly interviewing the patient, telling her she's sure that the patient will be able to go home tonight. About 5 minutes go by and they finally get her over to the bed from my stretcher. I get my paperwork signed. The nurse goes to check for dilation and lifts up the sheet only to find that the patient is crowning. She immediately starts yelling for help and gives me a dirty look. I whispered, "Told you so," winked and walked out as the rest of the nurses walked in to help. Not my most professional moment, but I had a good chuckle. "She gave you a dirty look for doing your job properly? Jeez." Some people would rather be right than do the right thing, and this lady clearly took someone else's correct opinion personally. Very satisfying to be in the position of the correct individual. My dad's a police officer and has always been known for his dark dad humor. One unfortunate day, a motorcyclist ran a red light at an intersection just before a truck stop and was run over. The rider's head and helmet were caught under the wheels of the truck and popped. As he tells the story, a lieutenant shows up and asks, "What happened here, and what are we stepping in that's so sticky?" My dad said, "Well, the rider lost his mind." I thought it was funny, as did my dad. Apparently, the lieutenant did not. When I was an EMT and I had a psych patient that had been picked up at the airport by the cops after he was found wandering around barefoot, my report from them was quite vague, so I didn't really know what to expect when I was asking him questions. He didn't seem very oriented and kept drifting off to sleep. I asked him if he knew what year it was, and he said 1985, and he suddenly yelled, 1.21 gigawatts! I was so startled I couldn't help but laugh. I still don't know whether he was messing with me or not, but either way, he must really like Back to the Future. I was an EMT. We responded to a call at a nursing home for a psychological. Got the info from the nurse that the dear little old lady is apparently hallucinating cats. I walked into the patient's room and asked, "Meow, what seems to be the problem here?" My partner and the nurse ran from the room. I found them literally on the floor laughing in the hallway. So I don't know if I fit the category, but this story made me lose all professionalism in a heartbeat. I'm a social worker, so I interview a lot of children. One of the standard questions is asking if children know where their private parts are and asking if anyone has ever touched them there. So I ask this 11-year-old if anyone has tried to touch her, and she says no. I ask if she knows what to do if someone tries to do that. She tells me that whenever she goes to a friend's house, she has a pair of scissors under her pillow for protection. I chuckled a bit, but maintained my composure. I asked the girl if she would tell anyone. She says she'd tell her mum and tell that she didn't kill them on purpose. I lost it. I couldn't continue the interview after that. I told my supervisor about it and she just laughed. A young lady admitted into the ER, embarrassed to death with a small piece of plastic from a toy stuck in her lady parts. While getting an IV from the nurse, she complained about getting jabbed with a metal needle. The nurse started to explain how the IV catheter is actually plastic, to which she responded, "I've got enough plastic stuck in me right now, thank you very much." Back in my army days, we were in the process of doing an 18-mile ruck march. It's pretty hot out. All of a sudden, one of my squad members collapses to the ground. The medics rush to him and start sticking an IV in his arm while asking him questions. "Do you know where you are? Do you know what month it is? Do you know what day of the week it is?" He looks up, confused. Waffles. "No, you fricking moron. Let's get him out of here." It's been brought to my attention that something similar has happened in a documentary where the guy mentioned hash browns. Heat exhaustion is some pretty crazy stuff. It happened to me once. I was very confused and all I could think about were mashed potatoes. I followed everyone, not quite knowing what was going on, and ended up in the chow hall. Standing in the line, someone must have noticed something was wrong. He asked if I was okay, and I responded, "I don't know, I just need mashed potatoes." They were talking to me some more. I don't know what they were asking, and all I could do was answer, "Yes." They led me to the front of the line. Turns out they were serving mashed potatoes. Best damn potatoes I've ever had. After resting, eating and drinking, I was fine though. I was a newish certified nursing assistant, and a patient caught the bus, self-deleted, during my shift. The aide who had the woman on her assignment grabbed me and another newbie to show us how to do post-mortem care. We undress the body and begin to wash it. I'm standing on one side, other newbie on the other, experienced aide at the foot of the bed. We roll the body onto its side towards me and it moans. The newbie got bug-eyed and started to freak out. The experienced aide explains that it's just air leaving the lungs and passing through the vocal cords. The newbie accepts this but is clearly freaked out. It's her first dead person. We roll the body the other way and it moans again. Newbie begins to freak out again. By now I'm no longer on task and just amused as heck by the newbie. Then the newbie glances at our deceased friend's face. In the course of rolling the body back and forth, her eyelids had been pushed open. Newbie starts to panic. She's looking at me. Oh God, she's looking at me. Why is she looking at me? Newbie then runs out of the room and I just lose it. Can't hold it together anymore and I start to laugh. After the moment passed, I felt a little bad laughing while preparing a body for the funeral home, but I know that our patient would have found the situation hysterical too. Ex-corrections officer. I was caught on camera laughing wildly while having to subdue an undressed man covered in number 2 wielding a butt shank. He'd used the brown stuff to paint on Peter Criss makeup. That stuff cracked me up. Well, I'm guessing that particular Kiss tribute band didn't take off then. Sad. I feel it would have been novel, if not good. Firefighter here. I was doing a primary search on the first floor when my captain and I crawled straight into a special dungeon. The call started out pretty normal as far as emergency dispatches are concerned. A neighbor sees smoke coming out from a house nearby, the proper address is given, and we roll out. On scene now, and the neighbors have gathered and informed us that the homeowner is usually gone this time of day. But usually doesn't cut it in the fire service, so we're going in. So my captain and I grab a handline and went to complete a primary search of the first floor as the rest of the arriving responders set up a second floor egress route and pull more handlines. So as soon as we get in the front door, amen Halligan, we stick along the right side wall and move further into the house. Thermal imaging shows no heat, but there was a ton of smoke coming from the door that leads to the basement. We head down the stairs after a careful sounding, and this is when stuff got weird. Imagine a room full of hot smoke. That smoke will rise, and since this smoke was coming from the basement, the lower we got into the basement, the more smoke cleared. Walls, ceiling, floor all lined with rubber, and a close rack full of rubber suits. A table with straps, all also covered in rubber. Whips, cuffs, some special toys, and things that shouldn't belong in any chamber related to doing the deed. And the most effed up part we found down there was the homeowner, in a full dungeon uniform, trying to put out a fire that was running from the top of the light stand he had set up to the ceiling. It wasn't too big to be honest, but way too big to be fanning with a folded rubber suit while wearing another rubber suit in a room covered in rubber. This guy must not have realized all the gross, toxic, thick smoke heading up the stairs and out of the house. Honestly, I don't know how long he was down there, but without my SCBA on, it felt like I was snorting Rubbermaid. We grabbed the homeowner, who was now suffering from severe overheating and exhaustion because he was in a full-body rubber suit panicking, and then we got the fire out. So when did I laugh when I shouldn't have? Well, right as we came into full view of this chamber, I looked back at my God-loving Christian captain, who was just in shock as his worldview was altered. So I started cracking up there, and once you start laughing when you're not supposed to, it's impossible to stop. So I'm losing it, as well as my oxygen supply. I've seriously never gone through a tank that quick in my career. So the fire was out, and people were gathered, as at any fire, barn or house, and were watching two firefighters, one of whom was laughing his butt off, carry this black, steamy, rubber-covered creature out of his house. Then we have to start getting this guy's outfit off because he's showing signs of extreme exhaustion. I calmed down enough to cut this guy out of his suit in front of all his neighbors, who are now realizing this steamy black creature is their neighbor. That's when we figured we should disperse everyone to give the guy a little privacy. We even pulled the trucks up to block most of the scene. All in all, the guy thanked us but said he was quite embarrassed about the whole thing, which was quite obvious. He was a pretty normal guy as far as I'm concerned. He explained a little about how he likes the feeling of rubber, completely airtight around his skin, which was unneeded information, but I'm not the one to tell anyone how to live their life. You do you, rubber suit man. We had an OD we responded to that turned into a running joke at the station. Some girl tried to self-delete and took like 2 milligrams of fentanyl. Normal doses are in micrograms, not milligrams. Anyway, got her close enough to the ER and pumped her full of Narcan and she woke up. Partner opened the back doors and said, "All better, huh?" And she was angry about it and whined about how we didn't know what we were doing. I was being a bit of a jerk and said, "Well, the Narcan was a great guess then." To which she screamed, "Narcan don't do crap." And now whenever we use Narcan, it's good form to shout, "Narcan don't do crap," while pushing it. Little old racist white ladies are always good for a giggle as well. When did sheer luck save you from catastrophe? So I would say I was around 10 years old and my family decides to take the dog for a walk. I decide I want to rollerblade and make big circles around my family as they walk. At one point I end up a block ahead of my family and a rusty beat-up truck pulls up and stops, and a guy jumps out. I remember him having a super short beard. He says, "Hey kid, check this out." And he pulls out a skateboard and rides it on the street and says, "Pretty cool skateboard, huh kid? You want it?" I, being completely happy with my rollerblades, say, "No thank you." He says, "Come on, it's free, just come over here and take it." I said, "No, I like my rollerblades." At this point, he looks down the street and sees my family walking up it. Without saying anything to me, he throws his skateboard in the back, jumps in his truck and drives away. I never thought it was weird, didn't tell my parents, and in my head it was like, some dude just tried to give me a skateboard I didn't want. 10 years later, I'm like, holy frick, thank God I didn't fricking like skateboards. In short, didn't get kidnapped because I thought skateboards suck. Finding out from an auntie from my dad's side that my parents were going to let my mum's sister and husband adopt me as a baby because they were childless for a long time. If the transaction happened, it would have been kept a secret. Thank goodness it never happened. The woman is a nutcase and the husband ended up divorcing her after they had a son. Their kid grew up whacked and feral and my parents became his guardian. The poor kid didn't even know how to wipe his butt and had to be spoon-fed at age 10. This one happened to someone else, but it's still interesting. I'm 16 years old, and last year when I was walking home from school, I saw two little kids that couldn't be older than 9 who were walking home a little bit in front of me. I assumed they were brother and sister. Anyway, me being so much bigger with longer legs, I eventually started to catch up to them. And right when I was about to turn off into my street, I noticed a car pull up next to them and asked them to get in. My heart stopped when I heard the older one say, "But mister, we don't know you." After that, I kept walking towards them and screamed out, "Lucy, Mark," because I didn't know their actual names, and they both looked at me. I ran up and said, "Guys, don't run off on me like that. Stay close." I pretended like I didn't see the car pulled up next to them and walked with them until the car drove off. They asked me who I was, but I just kept telling them to be quiet until the man goes away. When the guy left, I told them not to talk to strangers and walked them home. I explained to their parents what happened, and I don't think I've ever seen more grateful parents. Don't talk to strangers, kids. So wait, who are you now? Shut up and do what I tell you to do. Which stranger to trust, the calm ones who park next to you in their car, or the one who runs up screaming and pretending to be your sibling? I'm going to say that the assertiveness of this author probably saved those kids. First, let it be known that I have a gift/curse where people feel like they can tell me their life story. Strangers especially. I rode the city bus from a ghetto part of town to Homelessville, where I had to transfer to home. There were a few regulars, but every now and again there'd be someone new and inevitably they'd sit next to me. I was at the transfer bus stop with 3 other people. An old man who spoke no English, so I'd never spoken to. This twitchy gang dude had gotten on the first bus a few stops after I did. Then there was a man in a suit. He looked like the love child of a successful black guy and The Rock. He sat next to me and started a conversation. I don't remember exactly what it was, but something about his line of questioning creeped me out. On the surface, it wasn't anything like, "What undies are you wearing, little girl?" And aside from sitting way too close, he didn't try to touch me. Maybe I was just too wary of strangers, but I just didn't want to talk to him, and I hoped he got onto another bus. However, I was raised to be polite and couldn't think of a way to tell this guy to please stop talking to me. Then twitchy gangbanger plops down next to me on my other side, also too close. Now I'm sandwiched between 2 guys, and Twitch was almost leaning over me. He starts talking loud and fast, rambling and mumbling to where I can't understand a word. Creepy guy eventually gets up to go stand next to no English, but I still have Mr. Twitchy. Twitchy then proceeds to tell me his life story. He claimed to be in a well-known gang, and I thought he was saying this to appear tough, though he was flying the right colors. He then talked about his role in the gang and how his dealer ripped him off earlier that day. He was pointing to scars on his arms and face and explaining to me how he got them. My bus came and we all climbed into it. Creeper had basically given up talking to me and sat somewhere near the front of the bus, while Twitch followed me to the back. He wasn't as close as he'd been before, so I calmed down ever so slightly. It also helped that I was sitting next to a regular who was blind, so if push came to shove, I could whip Twitch with the cane. He kept up with the constant monologue and didn't stop until Creeper got off the bus. Twitch then says, "Oh, I thought that weirdo was never gonna leave," and runs off. Before he does, I hear him asking the driver the quickest route to get back to where we'd been picked up. I went home and using the location and many hours, I found out that Creeper was a convicted, unspeakable act offender. A month later, I also saw a very familiar mugshot in the paper. Twitch was arrested for murder. In short, had a nice talk with a gang member who, it turned out, killed a lot of people. Also, he got on the wrong bus to protect a 16-year-old girl from an unspeakable act offender. Mine was a few months after I'd turned 21. I'm from India and frequently make trips from my house to Bombay, to one in another state around 1,000 kilometers away. It's a 20-hour journey because I prefer buses over trains. I've been doing it for over 15 years and always booked the exact same seat, 4 seats down from the driver on his side. This particular time, though, I booked my ticket late and instead got a seat on the opposite side of the bus. We'd just stopped for dinner, and once done, I got back to my seat and settled down with a book. As soon as we turned back into the highway, there was a thud and a lot of dust and glass flying around. Turns out a truck rammed into the side of the bus. No one was hurt more than a few scratches. However, in my usual seat there was a lady about 5 feet tall, and there was a huge block of wood that was stuck over her head. If I'd gotten in that seat, I'd have been decapitated. Was quite a what the frick moment and gave me some perspective on life. In short, didn't get my usual seat on the bus, was spared a decapitation. When I was about 7 years old, my twin, an older brother, and I had gone with a family friend to go to his mother's house. This was nothing out of the ordinary, as we'd gone with this man on several such occasions prior. We were living somewhere in Nevada at the time, nearish the California border. He'd asked my parents if it was okay for him to take the 3 of us for a visit, and my parents said yes. I'm not really sure at what time we left, but we never made it to his mother's house. I was looking forward to seeing her cat again. We drove for hours, my brother, sister, and I in the back seat. This man didn't stop to let us out for a bathroom break, and he didn't have anything other than beer for us to drink, and he was drinking as well. After another hour or so of driving, he got pulled over. He told us not to say anything to the officers. They approached his vehicle and could smell the beer coming off him in waves. They noticed us in the back seat and asked if we were his. He, of course, said yes. The officers didn't believe him. Thank God. They asked him to step out of the car and placed him under arrest. He fought them the entire time until they clubbed him into submission just to get him in the back of the cruiser. Another CHP showed up and took us with him to a foster home where we stayed until our parents could come to pick us up. It wasn't until 15 years later that I'd learned that the man had pretty awful intentions with the 3 of us. I never thought of the fact that he didn't bring any of my brothers with us. When the officer asked him why that was, he simply replied that the other brother would have talked. In short, kidnapped at 7, forced to drink beer when thirsty, and nearly the victim of God knows what by a drunk man before he was arrested. Let this be a lesson to parents listening. It's not just strange men you have to look out for. Even acquaintances like this can have pretty sinister intentions. Scary stuff. I was born in Boynton Beach, Florida, and spent my first few years in a home that skirted some really rough neighborhoods. Though the houses on my street were mostly low-income and minority families who were just trying to raise their kids, occasionally we'd have some break-ins or gang fights overflow into our community. For a span of a few years, we had a smack-addicted homeless man who would hit our neighborhood for easily pawnable goods to support his habit. The cops always knew it was him and would lock him up for a few months, and then when released, he'd be at it again. I was really young, just under 3 years old, the night he broke into our house for the second time. He woke me up as he was shining a flashlight into my bedroom window looking for an easy way in. And moi, being the headstrong toddler that I was, got up to investigate the policeman's flashlight, as I later told my mum. Apparently, I must have scared the crap out of him when I sleepily greeted him as he came in through our kitchen window, because he abandoned all intention of robbing our home and instead picked me up to rock and soothe me back to sleep, laid me down on our living room couch, and hightailed it through our rear door. I'd forgotten the whole incident completely by the time my mum retold me the story later in life, and initially was freaked out by my 3-year-old description of the scary man with the long fingernails. However, I look back at it now with a level of humility. It could have been someone else, much meaner and a far more tragic situation. This man, who was bottom of the totem pole by most societal standards, an addict, homeless, and with petty theft on his crime list, was still a human being who chose to be gentle with a child. In some ways, it restored my faith in humanity. I was driving down a country road at night. I saw a deer crossing sign and decided to slow down significantly for the upcoming blind corner. Came around the corner going about 20 km per hour as opposed to the 80 posted limit. In the middle of the fricking road is some moron walking and wheeling his bicycle. I stopped about 3 inches shy of hitting him. If I'd been doing 80, I would have had to dig a grave. I like how you go right past, would have had to call the cops or fill out lots of paperwork, right to dig a grave. And you've got to dig quick too. If you spend too much time on the grave, someone will walk by, start asking questions, and, well, now you've got to dig another one. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. When I was in kindergarten, a man I didn't even recognize came to walk me home. Being as stupid as I was, I grabbed my bags and went with him. I'm not sure how, but he even knew my name, I think. We chatted and he walked me home, and as I walked through the doors, my parents ran to me. Turned out they were looking for me everywhere, thinking I'd been kidnapped. My teacher had told them that I'd left with a man claiming to be a relative. To this day, nobody knows who the man was that walked me home. I was chased by an adult male when I was 7. My mum asked me to deliver some eggs and sugar to a neighbor. Typical upper-class, northeast neighborhood, no crime. After I delivered the goods, I started back home, about a quarter mile. There were no streetlights and it was very dark that night, dark enough that I could barely see anything, when I got to a long bend with bushes on both sides. I just passed a driveway when I heard a loud rustling behind me, so I jumped and looked back at the same time and I saw a large, dark figure emerge from the bushes towards me. I was a fast kid, fastest in my class, fastest in my soccer club, and all I could think of was how dark it was and how if I tripped on something, I was a goner. I could hear a man's grunt and inhales and exhales close behind me. I couldn't hear his feet though, just his breath, and it sounded like he was no more than 5 feet behind me. I kept thinking all I had to do was get within sight of my front yard with all those lights and he would turn back and quit. But when we got that close and we were running in the light, I could feel him pressing harder, and I felt like he was getting closer. I decided to take a shortcut through a hole in a row of bushes that bordered our land. My siblings and I had used the shortcut pretty much every time we walked in that direction, so I knew there was a 2-foot drop to the driveway. I ran and ducked through the hole and into my driveway, and I could hear him crash through the bushes. Didn't hear him fall, and he was still after me. When I got to about 20 feet from my front door, I no longer heard him, which was good because I fumbled with the screen door, and in doing so, I got my pinky finger caught and cut off the last knuckle. I opened the heavy front door, jumped inside, slammed it shut and locked, screamed out for my dad, and didn't notice my finger was missing a knuckle until my mum let me go from a long hug. My dad ran out after the guy with a weapon, but he was gone. My dad came back, fished out the end of my finger and put it in a bag of ice to take to the hospital. But they said it was pointless, no pun intended, to try and reattach it. Forget why exactly. The police took my story, looked around, but aside from the bushes being jacked up and some grass pressed down in an obvious pathway across my yard, there was nothing. A few months later in a neighboring town, there was a boy about my age who went missing while walking from a friend's house late at night. Then another a few months after that. I never heard anything about the fate of those kids, and for all I know, it's not at all related to my being chased. But it erased the idea I tried to believe that maybe some guy was just messing around. A scenario that let me forget the fear of going outside at night. The boys' disappearances also made me very appreciative for life. And fast feet. Sorry for the long story, I haven't really thought about it in a very long time, so retelling it has reminded me I need to talk to my 2 kids about being safe around people. And maybe I should have them come with me to run the track for a few laps. Years ago, I was walking on the sidewalk during one of those silent hill days that San Francisco has sometimes, the entire world filled with fog, every sound muffled. Still on the sidewalk, I turned to cross the street and paused for absolutely no reason with my hand up in front of me, and felt something tingle on my fingertips. Something flat and yellow appeared and then disappeared in front of me in a flash, at hip level, without making a sound. It took me about 10 seconds to realize what I'd just seen was a taxicab streaming by at about 50 miles per hour that had been unable to see the road and had driven onto the sidewalk. The tingle I felt in my fingertips was my hand touching the side of the passenger's side window. In short, I'm the luckiest motherfricker on the planet. See, I've never witnessed one of those pea-super fogs that makes it literally impossible to see the road you're driving on from your car, but I feel like this is more of a driver problem than it is a weather problem. When I was around 9, I went roller skating with my older friends, who were around 12 years old. We had just skated out of our neighborhood area when I realized that I forgot something. So I skated home, which was literally 2 minutes away, got whatever, and headed back. I found out that my 2 friends had crossed the small road while I was gone and had gotten hit by a driver who ran the red light. It was a hit and run. It was especially sad because one was a long-time ballet dancer and she was never able to recover from it. Mum and I were coming home from the mall when I was 10. My mum says that she thinks the car behind us is following us. She makes a series of random turns, and the guy is still behind us. She sees a cop car sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store, so she pulls into the parking lot and drives up to the cop. The man then hightails it around us and out of the parking lot, flipping us off as he passes us by. I'm still curious as to why he was following us. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, I was watching TV in the basement with my dad while my mum was out with her friends. We heard the door open upstairs and someone walking around. My dad told me to go upstairs and say hi to my mom, and being lazy, I refused. A few hours later, my mom came home and she asked my dad if he'd moved some of the stuff in our house because it was missing. We had been robbed. If I hadn't been so lazy, I would have gone upstairs and that guy might have taken me too. He might have also seen that someone was home and fled, but the other option is really scary to think about. I also avoided a confrontation with robbers. When I was in high school, I took courses at the college 40 minutes away, and the pizza joint where I worked was relatively nearby. Sometimes on days when I had a huge gap between class and work, or no work in the afternoon or evening at all, I would go home and take a nap, pretty much completely undressed. One day I had a long gap, but I decided that I needed to go get some new shoes for work, and so I didn't end up going home that day. I got a call from my mum as I was trying on shoes that someone had broken into the house. If I hadn't decided to buy shoes that day, the 2 to 3 men who broke in would have come across me in the back bedroom, a 17-year-old girl sleeping and undressed. Yikes. In short, brought shoes instead of napping at home and avoided confrontation with robbers in my groggy, undressed state. I was four-wheeling with some friends up in the Rocky Mountains last summer. I'm not from the US and this was my first time, so I was just a passenger. Everything was going normally, at least as normal as I think, yelling yee-haw while listening to the Team America soundtrack, when we took a turn a little too sharp and high-centered on the edge of a cliff. It was like slow motion as we slowly crept towards the edge and I decided to put on my seatbelt. The car got stuck on a mound, but wouldn't move backwards. I think the mound was the only thing that slowed us down enough not to go off the cliff. We were literally an inch away from plummeting to our doom while "America, frick yeah!" was blasting through the speakers. We don't let Corey drive anymore. I hope you see this, Corey. You're an awful driver. I was 19 years old, traveling by car alone through some pretty isolated towns. No cell phone. My trip was about 9 hours, and when you drive for that long, you end up driving with the same traffic for a while. There was a truck that had passed me and then slowed down to the point where it passed over and over. I was a little annoyed, but other than that, I didn't think too much of it. When I pulled over into a small gas station, it pulled over behind me, but didn't drive up to a pump. As I stood there while the gas pump ran, I noticed a man in the truck watching me, but didn't return the stare. I went into the shop to pay for my gas. As the cashier was putting my payment through, he looked surprised at something behind me. I turned around and my body felt like it could jump out of my skin. The man from the truck was standing close behind me, close enough to touch me by bowing his head. He didn't move, just stared. I walked around him and went to the restroom. I locked the door to the restroom as well as the stall door. When I opened the door, he was standing there waiting. As I walked to my car, he followed me. I stood by my locked car, keys in hand, looking at the man, who was a few feet behind me, in the reflection of the window. We stood there like that, him staring and me waiting to unlock my door. I was afraid that if I unlocked the door, he'd do something crazy like push me in and take off. What was probably almost a full minute later, he slowly walked around to the front of my car and said, "You be careful out there," before getting back into his truck. I got into my car, locked the door and waited. He didn't move his truck to pull out until I moved my car. I got ready to pull back onto the highway, waited until a chain of a few big slow logging trucks were about to pass, and then pulled out quickly in front of them, nearly cutting them off, before gunning my poor little car's engine to speeds that had never before been at and has never been since. I hoped that I'd run into the police and get pulled over, but I didn't. This was near a piece of highway where women have gone missing before. In short, possibly could have been a missing woman along a dangerous stretch of road. "You be careful out there," were some of the most chilling words I've ever heard. In middle school, I volunteered to work one period for the school library rather than have study hall. I got along really well with the head librarian. I'd say he was the first adult I thought of as a friend. He was really friendly towards me. A few years later, I came home from college on break and my mum starts asking me questions about him. Turns out, he had been inappropriate with several people at the school. In short, didn't become the victim of the librarian. Now I have self-esteem issues. When I was very young, probably 1 or 2, my biological father hired someone to take out my mother and I so that he could leave the country. We lived in Europe and you couldn't just leave without taking your wife or kids, and he didn't want to pay alimony. Fortunately, my biological father lied to the guy to convince him to do it and said that my mother was awful and that I was a brat. The would-be murderer saw us in a park and decided to warn my mother at a party he knew they'd both be at later on. A few clarifications, this happened between 1989 and 1991 in a country that was still technically a part of the USSR. My mother told me this story and I verified it with relatives independently. If we're all going to be skeptics, then I guess I can never be sure if it actually happened, and I can't trust anyone, but if I have to go through life thinking that, and thinking that my mother lied to me for no reason at all, then I'd rather believe a lie. What was the worst reason a teacher gave you a bad grade? Because he didn't read my paper. It was a university class where a TA was responsible for grading the papers. He was clearly overwhelmed and just reading introductions and grading based on them alone. I had a 2-part introduction that fully addressed the prompt, but as he only read the first part, I got my paper back with a big C at the top. I ended up getting full credit after I challenged the initial grade. My first large college paper, for a pre-Civil War history class, Freshman year came back with a giant red D written on it with practically no feedback. I was in a writing room and I'd always excelled at essays, so I was sort of shocked. Went to the professor and asked him about the grade and lack of instruction. He sighed, looked down and said, "Westhoff, I don't like you." He went on and on after that with some bullcrap reasons, but apparently the big issue came from the first week of class. He was talking about manifest destiny and said something like, "Now, you have to remember, back in these days, there were about 50 to 100 miles between towns out in the western USA. And I'd raised my hand and said that there was still 50 to 100 miles between towns in the western US. He said I was exaggerating and I told him I wasn't because that's where I grew up. That paper was 40% of our grade. He refused to change the grade or even reread it. I scraped a C+ in that class and I was so freaking proud of that grade, even though it was the worst grade I received in my life. At the end of the semester, I decided to ask him for his grading documentation to see if I could challenge the paper with the school, but he claimed that he'd already thrown it away. I found out later that was bullcrap too, but I didn't press any further. We had weekly spelling tests in my 11th grade English class, which I thought was a bit remedial by that point, and had probably said so in a not completely diplomatic way. The teacher even made you write any words you got wrong 5 times and hand that in to her by the end of the class. I'd typically get perfect scores on them, but one time I got a test back with no actual errors, marked as a 0%. My teacher's explanation was that she saw me talking to someone in our free period before class who ended up doing poorly, and that was my fault because I distracted them from possibly studying. Wrote in Chicago format and lost points. The assignment instructions said to write in Chicago format. To anyone curious, I did try and point this out. I basically still lost points, but they upped the final grade. I have nightmares about getting the wrong footnote format as a former history student. I seem to remember one of my courses using a different format than all of the other courses at my university, and it messing a lot of people up. I did a presentation in biology. The teacher told me she wanted me to do a creative introduction instead of just opening it with the standard, "Today I'll be presenting." So I did. I invented a short story about an old lady going to the supermarket and worked in some early symptoms of Alzheimer's, the topic I was presenting. I was so invested in that character, she had a name and backstory. I even drew up a few comic panels so that everyone could follow along easily. Then, at the end of my presentation, I asked my class which symptoms the old lady in the story had, and hence what stage her Alzheimer's was. I get my grade back and the teacher deducted points for the intro since she told me to do a creative intro, so it wasn't an original idea. What? Like what the heck? I came up with a story, I drew the comic panels, all of that was me. I felt so betrayed. If I hadn't done a creative intro, she would have deducted points, so I did one and she deducted points anyway. And after all that work, still grinds my gears. I was 15 at the time. I was taking a 1-week online class. In the syllabus, the teacher said you must post 6 times throughout the week. So I posted 6 times on Monday, once on Wednesday, and felt I was good to go. I got my grade and comments, and the teacher wrote, "I thought you had some good posts early in the week, but then you stopped posting, so I had to mark you down." I was annoyed by this, but then realized it was the last online course in the program, and frankly, I didn't care. I still graduated, and that certificate is proudly sitting in my junk drawer for all to see. Taking online courses now, and the rule in almost every single class seems to be 1 post and comment on 2 of your classmates' posts. Every week it's the same posts. This topic is really interesting and important. I really learned a lot, especially about, a quote from the lecture slide, then a few responses saying, "I really agree. This topic is really important in today's industry." A friend of mine got a -1 for scratching his head. Our teacher said he was faking it. I guess that teacher had too many bad experiences with women who faked head scratches. My 7th grade gym teacher gave me a D because I hardly ever smiled. My life sucked at that time. "You seem like an unhappy kid. Let me give you something else to be unhappy about because of it. The beatings will continue until morale improves." I got marked down because the staples weren't in the right spot for my essay, even though I had them top left corner like always. That's when you know the teacher doesn't like you and is literally looking for petty reasons to take points off. Not me, but a 7-year-old student I coached for a public speaking contest. She's a child prodigy, a self-taught, fluent English speaker in a country where very few people speak good English. She also has a natural sense of how to structure a speech and gives all of her speeches impromptu instead of memorizing. After she finished her speech, the first response from the judges was, "Do you think you speak better English than us?" Spoiler alert, she does. I spoke to them and none of them were truly fluent. They then gave her the second lowest grade possible. She got a bad grade for being better than the person grading her. What grown adult is freaking threatened by a 7-year-old who specifically has been trained for the task they're judging? I didn't like a movie that was supposed to be the teacher's favorite. She'd do stuff like this all the time to other students as well. Complaints were made, but I graduated before I saw where they led. She gave me a 0 because she didn't think that I'd read the book. She said I would have gotten a 75% if she thought I'd read it. 75% of the test questions right supposedly means I didn't actually do the reading. Still one of those things that tease me off even 10 years later. In the 90s, my family didn't have a computer and I had no access to one. I spent a lot of time on a handwritten assignment for school and the teacher gave me a B, writing as a comment, "I would have given you an A if you had typed it up on a computer." I'm still bitter. My teacher lost my coursework on the bus home. I refused to redo a year's worth of work in 3 weeks and I got taken from an A to a C. Bullcrap. The school sided with him. This happened at my secondary school as well. The teacher won't admit to losing the work, and then it becomes you versus them on if you actually submitted it or if they lost it. I've never seen a student win this argument. Seems like if you're going to pull that nasty stunt as a teacher, you should at least never admit that you lost it in the first place, even to the student. Just claim you never received the work. My friend failed French because she had a French accent. The teacher couldn't understand her French because the teacher was American. My friend had spoken French since she was 4. I got points off because of the bad grammar in the quote that I used. The quote was Oppenheimer's, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." I got a 10 out of 10 on a test, but my teacher took points away from me because she didn't want my classmates to be jealous of my grade. This was English class in a Dutch school, so English is a requirement. I was the only native English speaker in my class, and this was a course for adults only. 4th grade, the day before Thanksgiving break. There was no work to be done, of course, so we had a busy work art assignment. We were all handed graph paper and told to color each of the squares either yellow, orange, red, or brown, and once we finished, we were supposed to cut out corn shapes to make Indian corn decorations. I already thought this was stupid, and filling in all of the squares was tedious. So I traced the corn shape on the graph paper and only filled in the squares that would end up as part of the final product. This meant my decorations looked the same as all the others, but I didn't waste time filling in squares that would just get cut away. When the teacher saw what I'd done, she gave me a 50 for skipping work. A spelling test, not graded by the teacher but by the kid next to us. Kid named Anthony decided that all of my words that had letters U and E were switched and marked pretty much every word wrong. They weren't? Like, this was probably in 3rd grade, so my handwriting was chicken scratch, but that was really stupid to me. I was upset since it was the first time I failed something in school. I remember doing tasks in school all the time that required us to switch papers and mark each other. It was a way of saving time for the teacher, of course, but also a way to find out which kids were vindictive little jerks that wanted others to fail. When I was 16, in the middle of doing my GCSEs, my dad got into a serious car accident. He was in intensive care for about 2 months. During that time, we were told he would probably not survive. Thankfully, he pulled through, but in the meantime, I hadn't been doing any coursework or going to school. This happened in January, my exams were in May and June. I managed to do enough revision to pass my exams, but I never managed to finish my coursework for art class. The quality of my work was worth an A, but I hadn't done enough of it. I applied for mitigating circumstances, meaning that if I granted, my work could have been marked on quality rather than quantity. But for whatever reason, the school refused, so I ended up getting a bad grade. That was 10 years ago, and I'm still angry about it. I broke my right arm in the 3rd grade. I write with my right hand. The teacher gave me a bad grade because my writing with my left hand was barely legible. In the 3rd or 4th grade, some girl in my class broke her right arm, and the teacher did the same crap to her. And after the poor girl got upset about it, the teacher compromised by assigning some other girl to do her writing for her. They both had to sit at the very back of the room together, so the one girl could quietly dictate to the other all of her writing needs. Everything from multiple choice stuff to full-on creative writing assignments. And the girl who had to do the writing still had to do her own work and was given no extra time, as far as I know. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I failed a literature exam in college because I answered a question too well. We were supposed to write an essay comparing and contrasting one of the books that we read that semester to a modern concept or ideal. We'd known about this particular question for weeks, so he had plenty of time to prepare. Apparently, it's possible to be too correct, because the response I got was that, though it's clear I didn't plagiarize, none of my thoughts were original and matched too closely with the author's interpretation of the work. I was the only person in my class to not only fail, but to get less than a B. I got no other bad marks on the rest of the exam, either. He failed me based just on that one part. I, too, got a lowered grade for answering too well. I'd studied and been to all the class sessions, so I knew the material well enough to be very succinct in my answers. Only filled half the blue book instead of BSing the whole thing. He gave me a C only because it was too short. From then on, I went back to skimming the reading and BSing the entire blue book tests. Made A's the rest of the semester. In high school, I used the word lascivious to describe a character in a book, and my teacher didn't know what that word meant. So logically, he took off a point. Me? Miss, you didn't give me a point for this, but it is on the mark scheme. The teacher? I don't agree with the mark scheme, so I didn't give you the mark. For context, this is a standardized test, which is why there is a mark scheme. This is a practice test. We used past papers and hence past mark schemes. Still complete bullcrap, though. By the same standard, if the narrator becomes a teacher, he can mark people down if he doesn't like the standard pens the students are issued. I got an F the first semester in chemistry, and I was really pushing myself to get a better grade for the next semester. I needed a good grade to study what I wanted. Then we heard that another teacher from another school would make the test, but the teachers in our classes would grade it. So I've been doing all in my power, reading everything, written summaries, doing the math, watching documentaries, and I got the final grade, D, and I was very happy with that. Then my teacher takes me aside and tells me that I actually got a way better grade. C could pass as a B, but if he gave me a C, it would look bad for him since I got an F on his test the semester before. So I was pretty teed off with that, but he left before I could say anything. It was my last day of school as well. When I was in college, I had a professor walking around collecting a homework assignment that was 10% of our grade. Being the unorganized person that I am, I was digging through all of my folders trying to find which one has it. She walks by me as I'm still looking and meanders toward her podium. Before she even gets to the front of the class, I find it and run it up to her to hand it in. She looks me dead in the eyes and said, "That's late. You got a 0. I called her a string of horrible things. She really was, this was just the final straw, and dropped the course and took it again with an amazing professor the next semester. Didn't happen to me, but a teacher kinda gave everyone in a class bad grades because they ditched her. They all planned to hang out after the last class. I guess she was bitter about it. This would be an A paper from other students, but you can do better. I got a C and no other feedback on how to improve. Area of improvement. Learn that overachieving only leads to more work, no job promotions because you become indispensable at your job, and non-monetary achievement certificates to hang in your cubicle. That teacher did you a favor, to be honest. I wish I was joking. I had a crappy religion professor back in junior high school. She lowered the grade of another student because they'd written in the exam that when Moses got the 10 Commandments, there was lightning when the correct answer was thunderbolts. Serious non-native speaker here. I know the difference between thunder and lightning, but what exactly is a thunderbolt? It's another way of saying a lightning bolt. Not really a correct way, but a way. I had a high school French teacher who failed me on a written test for using pencil. He claimed his eyes only saw pen. My family was outraged and called the dean, and the dean was like, "Oh well, he's getting them ready for standardized tests." My entire family had master's degrees, or more, and were like, "What standard test is in pen? It's always pencil. This is a school." Years later, I have my doctorate, and not one gosh darned test ever was pen only, standardized or otherwise. My paper didn't make her feel happy. It was an analytical writing course designed to teach how to write a thesis. The teacher was one of those super hippie artsy people, and most of the curriculum involved just writing articles she failed to get published. So we had to do this analytical discourse on someone's work, and it was trash, so I picked it apart. I got an F. I went to her saying, "What the frick?" I followed the rubric to the T. Her response, "Oh, well, the paper was good and all, but it didn't make me happy. It was kind of mean, and I don't like mean." I said, "The assignment was to find flaws in the paper. It had countless." And she replied, "Yeah, but it didn't make me happy. You get an F." I went to the chair, and it turns out her father was on the board of directors and she had sued the school several times, so she was bulletproof and got to do whatever she wanted. My grade came because all tasks had room for interpretation, multiple answers, and opinion, but my teacher only accepted his own exact opinion, interpretation, and choice. And I just remembered I had a teacher who gave me a D because he lost one of the 2 papers I gave in for my math exam. I took a low-level, the lowest possible, modern literature course in college. The professor was apparently someone people knew. They had us read Dracula, specifically a copy of Dracula that they had edited, or something. I don't remember exactly what the contribution to the specific edition was, but their name was on the copy of a book originally published more than 100 years prior. The professor accepted no original thought, or even really unoriginal thoughts unless they were cribbed directly from them. I made the very basic connection between Dracula and the serpent in the garden. There's a passage in the book that straight up makes this comparison if I remember it right. It was dismissed as unfounded because that's not what the professor had talked about in class. The professor just wanted us to parrot back what he said in class on the test essays. It was a surprise to me that there was more creativity in some of my low-level engineering courses than there were in my low-level literature courses. When you have more open interpretations in math-heavy subjects than in your subjective opinion of literature, there's an English teacher who needs to be fired. Damn tenure. Also, the next story contains Spanish and you're going to have to excuse the narrator's terrible pronunciation. Not a bad grade, but I remember I was so close to being the first person to ever score 100% on my 10th grade Spanish final. The one question I got wrong was, ¿Qué tipo de comida es el pescado? What type of food is fish? The answers were A. El carne, meat, B. La fruta, fruit, C. El pan, bread, D. La verdura, vegetable. I of course picked meat and got it wrong because my teacher insisted that fish isn't meat. She's a Catholic and eats fish on Fridays during Lent. According to her, the correct answer is fruit because fish are sometimes known as the fruit of the sea. What the actual frick? Screw your 99%, senora. She liked my dad, so she gave me a bad grade and called him to go talk to her about it. I thought my design teacher had it in for me as he kept giving me Ds for what I considered pretty good artwork. So to prove it, I had my professional graphic designer father do my homework, another D. Then I had my professional illustrator mother do it the following week, D. When we called him out, he didn't really have an excuse on why he considered professional standard design work only to be worth a D in a grade 10 project, but we enjoyed calling him out in a meeting with the head of the year. I lost 2 points out of 10 on an assignment because a full mark means perfection and only God is perfect, and -1 point is only for instructors and professors. Each point mattered at the time because a full scholarship was on the line depending on our grades through the semester. Just to clarify, I lost 2 points out of 10, which is actually 2% of the whole grade. This was in the United Arab Emirates. I lost several more grades and similar assignments. In one of them, it was questions from a paragraph, so once I asked him and went through the answer step by step logically, he got defensive, accused me of wronging him and that he grades arbitrarily, and left the class. I lost 3 more points after that. I lost the A grade even before the final, and thus lost my chance at the scholarship. Nobody in the administration cared. I still resent him to this day. Essay topic. Was Henry V a hero? I argued he wasn't because crazy risks involved. You're not allowed to make that argument. F. Because I was homeschooled. I was getting my AA at a local community college and was getting my electives to pursue a degree in teaching. Several of our papers required us to write about our classroom experience as children. I got very poor grades on those, and when I asked the professor, she essentially said it was because I had no real classroom experience. Because little boys don't work hard enough to get an A, despite the homework, classwork, and exams being straight A's. I never tried again and coasted from then through graduation 10 years later. I was 7 or 8, in 2nd grade, so early 90s. She said that to me, then said it to my parents at the parent-teacher meeting a few days later when I complained. They complained too, and the school sided with her. The next year, the school put me with the best, most influential teacher I would ever have. Just a beautiful human being. I would even go back to visit her every year until she moved out of state. Miss her like hell. She even wrote me a letter of recommendation for getting into college. A super long shot, but Miss Showman, if you ever see this, I still love you and my whole family still misses you. Handwriting. Often when the teacher refuses to let me type it. For the final submission of my graphic design college qualification, the brief was to design branding for a pub or club. I got a B because my concept was too cool. The brief was pretty basic and open-ended. It was basically along the lines of a brand new night spot has opened in the city. It's a pub during the day and converts to a club after hours. Design and develop a brand to promote this new place in the city. She apparently pictured a sort of dive bar in her head when writing the brief, but it was never made clear. She'd never once mentioned it when looking at the interim development stuff as I worked on it over the month we had to finish it. I could have changed tack at any point, but she never course-corrected me. The sheer mind-fricking bullcrap of that actually knocked me so hard that I didn't even bother pursuing it as a career beyond that course. What are some unexpected ways a potential hire tanked their chance at a job? English is my second language. I moved to the US after college and got an interview for an engineering position at a top aerospace company. I was nailing it, as far as I know, until the hiring manager asked, "How is your relationship with your current manager? Would it upset him if you leave, or would he say good riddance?" I thought good riddance meant something positive, like good luck or best of wishes, so I said she'd say the latter. I didn't get the job. A great example of why no one should be afraid to ask questions in an interview. I once saw a resume that stated they were a valid Victorian. Either they were trying to say they were the top of their class, or that they were a genuine person from 19th century England, neither of which were true. I recruit for the blue-collar industry, and there was a poor guy where English was second language who kind of struggled to understand me, but we had Samoan and Tongan-speaking staff who were assisting in the recruit process. We were through the interview process, and while pre-employment substance screening via urine sample, I was explaining, in depth I might add, the requirements of the test. Pee in the pot up to here, close the lid and bring to me for the test. When he was taking quite some time to pee in the pot, which can happen if people are a bit nervous or shy, I called out to see if he was okay, which he said, "Yeah, boss." About 10 minutes later, he appears and the pot is wrapped securely in hand towels so as to not be on display. I found this odd, as the amount of samples we do meant that we were so used to handling pee it was second nature. He looked a little sheepish and coy, very telling of someone who perhaps was a little nervous that they might fail. I took the cup from him, with sanitary gloves on of course, and proceeded to unwrap the pot in order to undertake the test. I gagged when I realized he had shoveled his number 2 into the pot, assuming he needed to provide a more solid sample. What possessed him to think we wanted to analyze his brown matter is beyond me. Fair to say we couldn't employ him on that day on that basis. I sent him away after some explanation and he was quite embarrassed. Having saved him all the embarrassment I could, he came back the next week to correctly complete the test after I'd set him up with a colleague and proceeded into a job the very next day. 2 years later, he's one of our most reliable and hard-working staff. As someone who works in their second language, I've made some embarrassing gaffes and mistakes in my life. Some of them make me cringe to this day. However, I've never shuffled my own number 2 into a cup and handed it to my boss, so there's that. Props on him for being able to do it on command, actually. In my job, I've interviewed hundreds of individuals. One that stands out for an entry-level retail position, I called him for an interview and after introductions, brought him up to the break room for the interview itself, as the training room was in use. He was kinda sketchy looking, wearing a beat-up black cap and what looked to be a dirty hoodie. But I didn't think too much of it because A, I did call him on shorter notice, and B, I don't like to judge a candidate solely on how they look. And C, it's retail. What do you expect candidates to look like? I excused myself for 30 seconds to check in on my trainee, and when I came back, the candidate looked a little uncomfortable. Not thinking much of it, we start the interview asking the standard questions about what he's done previously, why he wants to work here, etc. I notice he continues to look uncomfortable and it almost looks as if he's hiding something in his hands. I eventually ask if there's something wrong I can assist with and he comes clean. He explains he has a fistful of candy, jelly beans in this case, and he's not sure what to do with them. I'm a bit gobsmacked and have questions, which I wish I could have asked. Where did he get this candy? Why did he think it was a good idea to eat candy in an interview? What was he going to do with this candy? As I tried to articulate a response, he exclaims, "I know," and proceeds to shove the entire handful into his mouth. And this isn't a couple of jelly beans. This is a massive handful of now sweaty, sticky candies that he has just thrown into his mouth. And he starts chewing and chewing. His hands are stained and he's really working his jaw due to the sheer amount and chewy nature of them. I swear 30 seconds pass before he finally gulps them down and asks calmly, You were saying. Needless to say, the interview didn't continue much longer than that, and unfortunately, the Candyman did not get a job with us. This is an old professor of mine's story. A long time ago, his department was looking to hire some kind of new junior assistant professor type. They'd narrowed it down to two highly qualified guys, both fresh out of grad school. They knew they were going to hire one or the other. As a final step of the process, they decided to take both of them out to dinner separately. The first guy was cordial throughout the whole thing and seemed to get along with everybody. Seems just fine. Then at the end of the meal, he picks up his empty plate and licks the whole thing clean. Like, tongue flat against the surface of the plate, covering every inch of it until it's clean, in the middle of a nice restaurant. Then he just sets the plate down like it was the most normal thing in the world. Everyone just stares at him and then awkwardly try to just wrap it up. Afterward, they laugh about it to each other like, what the frick? What a bizarre and unnecessary way to throw away a near clinch on a good job opportunity. So then they take the second guy out. Almost just a formality at this point. Again, everything is fine, he's polite, seems perfectly qualified, seems to know the right things to say. Then at the very end, they ask him if he's had any questions for them. He pauses and thinks for a moment, then goes, "So, what is the student-teacher dating policy?" Afterward, the other professors were sitting around together and one of them goes, "Well, looks like we're hiring the plate licker." Worked in onboarding for a while, basically just putting people that other folks hired through the hiring process. One guy wouldn't answer any of my calls, emails, or text messages. Then, in reply to emails from the hiring manager, said I hadn't attempted to contact him at all. Hiring manager sat 2 desks over from me and had listened to me leaving voicemails for 3 days. Guy promptly lost all chances at the job when he accused me of not doing my job. Opening line of the covering letter of their application. "Today is the day when my worst fears were realized." From there, it was a litany of everything that had ever gone wrong in their life. Sadly, it also seemed like they were the result of consistently bad decisions. I'd have thought that they were just deliberately trying to throw the application, except that it had just so much excruciating detail. It was a lot of effort. Job location: London. Candidate location: Denver. Candidate willing to relocate? No. I'm currently getting sent resumes from foreign nationals, some of whom aren't authorized to work in the US. We're a small firm that does 95% of our work with US Gov entities requiring a security clearance. Candidate arrived in rollerblades, stayed in rollerblades the whole interview. He used the word blade instead of walk or go for the whole interview. Can't tell if I was being punked. He was in his early 20s, resume was good but not great. The whole rollerblades thing wasn't a deal breaker, but it definitely didn't help. He insisted on sitting on the desk rather than on a seat, so his rollerblade feet could just hang. I had to insist a couple of more times throughout the interview for him to reluctantly take a seat, which didn't help either. "Well, you went to college. I studied the blade." It's a good thing the narrator wasn't the one in charge of the hiring process, because this guy seems rad as heck, and if he pulled that last line, I would have hired him for the ironic joy in a heartbeat. When I managed a retail store, it wasn't uncommon for people to bail on job interviews with last-minute or no notice. But there was only ever one person who no-showed the interview and then called the next week asking if they got the job. "So, do you guys do substance tests?" "Yes, we do." "For like all the substances?" "Yes." "Okay, thank you for your time." And then he got up and left. So it can be a good idea to call and check on your application, but don't call the store, ask for the owner, and see if he's looked at your application 1 hour after you left it with us. This person actually called 3 times throughout the day, and each time we told her, "The owner will review your application tonight after we close, as this is the busiest time of year for us. Spring at a greenhouse." Please don't name your resume "job crap." We had a guy come in for an interview and he showed up a full 40 minutes prior to his scheduled interview. 1-room office shared by 3 people, so there's no good place for him to wait. I said, "You can go to the coffee shop next door and come back at the scheduled time." He said, "No, I'll just wait here. I have a phone call to make." He proceeds to have a very loud phone conversation in our 1-room office. When it was finally time for his scheduled interview, he was still on the phone and he actually shushed me and said, "I'm on the phone." 10 minutes later, he was ready to be interviewed. Not even sure why we proceeded with that interview, but it was over quickly and his resume was in the recycling bin before the door even closed. Posted this before, but it's always good for a revisit. The applicant said, So, you all do background checks, criminal history for this job, right? Me? Yeah. Okay, so the court messed up, and when you run my background check, it's not going to say statutory, but it was totally just statutory. I work at a hospital on a surgery floor. We had two-part interviews, one with the unit manager and one with either a nurse or an aide. We have a series of questions to ask based on a survey they fill out at the end of the application. She managed to make her way to me, and this was her response to a question. If you saw a coworker doing something unethical, like stealing from a patient, what would you do? She said, "It depends if it was valuable or not. I mean, who hasn't stolen something before?" I had to take a personality test for a job once. The test was all questions like agree or disagree. It's okay to take money out of the till sometimes, or everyone steals from the register from time to time. At first, I was all, hell no, that's stealing. But by the end of the questionnaire, I thought maybe it was much more widely accepted than I thought. I was hiring in pharmaceutical sales, and it was a large launch for a to-be newly approved product, so they were hiring about 200 people nationwide. Because of this, first step was a phone screen with us, then a video interview with the hiring manager, before flying candidates out for the final panel interviews, where they would meet with 5 individuals, vice presidents of HR and sales of each region, and sales directors for those territories. Because of this, we were very strict with the interviews and who moved forward, which means it really sucked when a guy went into his final panel interview and started doing magic tricks. Very seriously, he started pulling flowers from his sleeves, and he tried to vanish an interviewer's coffee, but ended up spilling it everywhere instead. In that same round of hiring, we also had an individual who did his video call from his coffee table. He sat on the floor, and he had someone ring his doorbell. From the conversation with the hiring manager, he asked politely if he could go to answer the door in case it was an emergency. She said, sure, no big deal, and the guy stood up, flashing his tighty-whities. She didn't say much about it when he came back, but needless to say, she couldn't stop laughing when she told us about it. In short, don't do magic tricks in your interview unless you're interviewing to be a magician. If you do a video interview, please wear all of your clothes, pants included. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. My boyfriend just told me the story of a new bartender they hired who got fired after one day. Why? Because she couldn't open a can of beer. One of the places I worked at once fired a new bartender barely 3 hours into his first training shift. Why, you may ask? When the bartender training him sent him for more ice, he didn't return for over 20 minutes. Plus, when he did eventually resurface, he had no ice. The manager got weirded out and checked the cameras. He had spent his time rifling through bags in the staff area until he found a pack of smokes and a lighter, which he then took and went outside for a prolonged smoke break. My favorite part of this whole debacle was when he showed up a month later trying to return his staff uniform and get back the money he paid for it. The first uniform was free. Gotta respect the hustle if nothing else, and I mean it. I'm not sure that employee had any other redeeming features other than his drive to scam the place. Doing a text screen phone interview, and you could tell the guy was Googling his heart out every time we asked a question. He'd say, let me think about that for a second. The background ambient noise would cut off and then cut back a second later, and he'd start reading off stuff from the top Google result. I had somebody pull this on me once. It was the most obvious thing in the world. There'd be this huge pause before they'd all of a sudden just start rattling all kinds of facts off. If you actually knew the answer to that level of detail, it wouldn't take 15 to 20 seconds for you to start answering questions. At one point, I brought up the Wikipedia page for the subject on my phone while she answered, and silently followed along with her as she pretty much read it out to me. This was my first phone interview ever, so my boss was sitting with me. Afterwards, he told me that he nearly closed the interview by saying, "Well, you have a good Wikipedia-level understanding of things, but you're not quite what we're looking for." I once called a guy for his scheduled phone interview, and he answered the phone as if he thought I was a telemarketer. He was incredibly rude and asked who I was at least 3 times before understanding I was calling to interview him. After realizing his mistake, he wasn't even apologetic for yelling at me. It was a tense interview, and he did not move forward. I once called a woman for a scheduled phone interview, and her husband answered. It was a landline for better connection. I introduced myself as the individual calling for her interview, but when I asked to speak with the wife, the husband said, She's dead. I'd just spoken to her the day before the schedule and I said I was so sorry I hadn't realized and was so sorry for his loss. He didn't sound upset but kept repeating that she was dead and trying to usher me off the phone. So I said I was so sorry but would cancel her interview and would pull her information from our system so no one would accidentally follow up. I was starting to get the feeling that something wasn't right, but still trying to be respectful when he starts backtracking and asks where I'm calling from again. I told him again what company I was calling from for our scheduled phone interview, and he suddenly says, "Oh, I thought you were a telemarketer. She's right here in the other room," and hands it off. The wife was very angry with her husband. He had been trying to convince me for about 3 to 4 minutes that she had passed away, and it turned into one of the more awkward phone calls I've ever made. It was for other reasons that she didn't move forward, though. Had a guy who reluctantly told me he used to work at an adult store. To try and save him from feeling weird, I told him that my wife has always found it fascinating and would love to work in one. His response? Well, isn't she a frickin' weirdo? I'm a lobby guard, so I don't do the interviews. However, I have had interviewers ask me how the interviewee behaved in the lobby while waiting. Most just sit there twiddling their thumbs nervously, but 9 out of 10 times those who ask me questions about the company and the team they're interviewing for are hired, and 10 out of 10 times the people who are genuinely rude to me are never hired. I would have thought that this is common knowledge. Why on earth would you be rude to literally anyone when you're interviewing for a job? Assume that you're making an impression on everyone. I used to be a manager where we did a lot of hiring. I've now probably hired hundreds of people and looked at thousands and thousands of resumes. A lady with an MBA applied. At first glance, she seemed interesting, and then when I googled her school, it was clearly a degree mill with a somewhat similar name to a real university. There was also a guy who told me the only reason he was applying was because he was ordered to by a judge to get a job, because he was years behind on his child support. When asked what the story was on his lengthy employment gap, he also said he'd quit working to avoid paying child support. To top it off, he clearly wasn't qualified for the position and had lied his way into the interview in what I'm guessing was some kind of malicious compliance with the judge's orders. There was also a guy who asked my coworker on a date. During his interview, he didn't get the job or the date. The entire job was doing phone support. She said she didn't like talking on the phone. Then there was the guy who stopped answering my question to tell me that wearing glasses was making my eyes dependent on glasses and I should stop wearing them. There was the fellow whose first question, before we even started, was about our indecent behavior policy. So were his second, third, and fourth questions, including detailed scenarios. I'm not sure if he was doing that for a sick joke, but either way, it wasn't great. Our male receptionist welcomed another one and escorted him to the interview room, where I was sitting. He asked if we were waiting for the receptionist to return and asked if I could make him a coffee while we waited. I explained that I was the hiring manager and he laughed at how funny it would be to have a female boss because it was so unexpected. And finally, when we started on the tech questions, this lady said she didn't know how to use a computer and wasn't going to learn because they were too complicated. She wasn't that old, maybe mid-40s, and it was only about 10 years ago. I have no idea how she made it in the world. I imagine that someone who works in mass hiring positions would basically be able to create a menagerie or circus of some of the individuals who they talk to. This lot would be a great start, and they'd be getting jobs. Win-win! I work in software development. As part of the interview process at my company, our candidates interview over Skype using a code-sharing website for them to complete a small and relatively simple problem to help weed out candidates who are dishonest on their resumes. In one of my interviews, I started with the usual introduction of myself, my role within the company, so on and so forth. I introduce her to the task and explain that it'll be on a code-sharing website and that she'll need to follow the link I'll send her to access it. I paste the link into the text window and explain to her how to access it. Some people haven't used Skype before and don't know how to access text chat in a video call. She smiles and nods and asks me when I'm done, "Will you be writing the link on the whiteboard?" What whiteboard? I look behind me and remember that yes, there is a small whiteboard behind me, and this woman was expecting me to handwrite the not-so-short link and she would read it off the webcam and type it into her browser. No, I explain, I sent you the link within Skype itself. If you'll just click… I'm forced to trail off as she reaches forward and picks up her webcam, which I'm assuming was mounted on the top of her monitor. I get a nice close-up of her eye as she peers inside the camera, then turns it on its side to observe it some more. I ask her what she's doing. "Trying to find the link," she replies. Dumbfounded, I once again explained that the link was sent over Skype and wouldn't appear behind me nor on the webcam. She resumes the smile and nod routine as I ask her to follow my directions to access the Skype text chat window. I ask her to wave her mouse cursor over my face until she sees some buttons appear. She takes her hand off the mouse, raises it, and waves it over the screen. I explain to her again that she needs to use the mouse, and she smiles and nods again. After about 15 minutes of a 30-minute interview, she did finally discover the link in the Skype text chat, but she proceeded to type it into her browser by hand. She did not make it to the next round. On the inverse of some of these other posts, I went into a job interview where the manager said, "Look, I don't really care, you're my 30th applicant in a week and everyone has failed the substance test. If you can pass the substance test, you're hired. I don't even care about anything else anymore." I passed. It was an awesome job and he was a great manager. I was doing a video interview with a candidate in a new office we were opening in another country. For background, it was a tech company, so we were a bit informal and I was wearing a company-printed t-shirt so you could easily see I have tattoos. This candidate calls in a few minutes late, but I give him the benefit of the doubt on that. We start talking and discussing the role when I hear his doorbell ring. He gets up immediately, yelling back to his computer that he'll be just a moment. I can hear him let the dishwasher repair person in, be guided to the kitchen and told all about the problems with said dishwasher. I sit there entirely dumbfounded but decide to continue the interview out of sheer curiosity. The candidate came back about 5 minutes later, answers some more of my questions, and then I asked what questions he has about the role so I could wrap this up. Apparently, this is what he was waiting for. "It's so cool that you've got tattoos. Did you do them yourself?" "No. Do you have any role-related questions?" "Well, I've done them all myself. Let me show you." The candidate proceeded to take off his shirt and point out each of his tattoos, telling me his age for each one. He even pulled his pant legs up to his thigh to show what he'd done on his legs. I was dumbfounded. He offered to send me his portfolio. He did not get the job. What's the worst thing you've been wrongfully accused of? Stealing money from work. My register was over $100 short one day. My boss made me undo all of my pockets and went through my backpack. I had to take off my shoes and socks in front of him. He had me shake out my clothes in front of him. It wasn't like he made me take them off, but in the middle of the kitchen he starts yelling at me to shake out my shirt and my undies in front of the whole class. He wanted to see my car, but I insisted that I hadn't left the restaurant. It just sucked. I was humiliated. I'd worked there for years without a single incident. I wouldn't say I was friends with the boss, but we were certainly friendly and on great terms. I get that he needed to check everything out in case something happened, but throwing all of my stuff out of my purse onto the ground and yelling for me to shake out my clothes wasn't necessary. A former friend worked as a barback at a family-owned pub, and money started disappearing during his shifts. The owner saw that on the days money went missing, he was the only one consistently scheduled. They approached him about the money and asked if he was having financial trouble. He denied taking the money. The owners were convinced that he was the thief and started treating him like crap, rescheduling him at the last minute, cutting his hours and giving him crap jobs. They complained about him to the other employees and to the regulars. They decided to put cameras behind the register to catch him in the act and told no one. The next time money went missing, they checked the footage only to find out that their daughter and her girlfriend were the ones stealing. They had the run of the pub, so seeing them come in on their days off wasn't unusual. They set him up. The messed up thing is they fired him anyway because they were embarrassed by all the crap talking they did and wanted to keep quiet about their daughter's theft. I was accused of mistreating a minor by a neighbor. I'd been babysitting my sister. I was 22 at the time, she was 3, and she was going through that silly phase most young children go through where they just want to run around in the buck all the time. My neighbor knocked on the door while I was cooking dinner. My sister streaked to the door and opened it before I could get there. The neighbor saw a buck-wild young kid and a grown man, assumed the worst, and called the cops and then called the other neighbors. The cops came out, talked to me, talked to my sister, called our mum and talked to her, talked to the neighbor. They realized nothing was going on and apologized for the inconvenience and left. Unfortunately, by then, the neighbor had spread the rumor throughout the apartment complex and people being people believed the worst. I became a pariah in that neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, the rumor spread throughout the town. It ended up making my life hell there, and I had to move to a different county to leave the rumors behind. I know a lot of parents with kids who seem to go through this stage. It's generally treated more with amusement than concern, but it can make for some awkward situations when your toddler decides it's time for a public display. Doesn't usually go this badly, though. Another story with similar wild accusations to follow. I was essentially accused of inappropriate behavior as a pre-kindergarten teacher. They always questioned me if I'd have to be in the room with the children alone. I was the opener, so I had 5 to 10 kids in the mornings before anyone else got there, even though it was literally part of my job. Parents would subtly try to ask me this kind of stuff or accuse, "You're the only one here in the mornings. Shouldn't there be a woman with you?" Just stuff like this says they don't trust me with their children. Not as bad as some people here, but it still hurts when all I wanted to do was teach children and help them learn. That's why, as a male, I'd never get into any kind of child-related care where I was the only one with them. I remember when I used to play ball at the park with my dog, I'd bring a bucket of balls and a bat and hit them off for him to retrieve. One day, a kid, about 7 or 8, comes over and asks to play with us. Me, being the friendly guy I am, says sure and hit him some ground balls. Next thing I know, this lady, his mom I'm sure, comes running over screaming at me about stealing her child or something. I was so embarrassed and it made me assess situations so that I won't be alone with any children, because apparently all guys out alone are sick freaks. On Christmas Eve, I was accused of stealing a customer's credit card after I left work for the night. It felt horrible for my team to have to deal with that on Christmas Eve of all days. The lady had come in to return an item earlier in the day. It was one of our Christmas special items that we don't normally stock. I told her this as she was still undecided about returning it. She went out to talk to her husband who was sitting in the car outside. Eventually, she decided to return it. I processed the return like normal. I didn't touch her card at any time. She put her card through the FPOS terminal. I had her sign a receipt to say that she had returned the item. I gave her a return receipt which shows FPOS refund on it. And that was that. Later that night, after I'd left, the husband came back. He was furious. The lady was with him, but she was quiet. He was yelling and throwing a massive tantrum, saying that the girl who served her, me, had stolen her credit card. He was demanding an apology from me or my team. Luckily, we have security cameras which face directly on the counter. They're very clear pictures. It was very, very obvious that the wife put her credit card back in her purse. Plus, a receipt will not be printed out if a card is still in the terminal, which meant she wouldn't have been able to sign anything if she had left it in there. The manager was not happy about him accusing me of this. He didn't get his apology. This reminds me of an incident involving myself a while back. I'd gone through a drive-thru, ordered food, and paid. I was on autopilot at the time. I received my drinks through the window and couldn't figure out where my credit card went. I informed the girl in the window and she checked her workspace while I dug through my car. She apologized for the incident and the manager gave me a card with her name and number to reach them if I couldn't find my card. Well, I stopped in the parking lot for a bit, searched some more, and decided to head home. On the drive home, I got a call from a man that told me he had reviewed their security camera and she had given me my card back. Before I could thank him for checking, he insisted the clerk did not steal the credit card. I never made that claim and it surprised me how defensive he was over the issue. He told me I could come to review the footage myself at a later date if I didn't believe him. When I got home, I went through the sides of the seats, under the seats, etc. until I did find my card. What happened is, when she handed me the drinks, she stuck my card between them and the card fell down the side of the center console. I didn't realize this at the time. I called them back to let them know I found my card just because of the potential drama I'd caused, even though I was calm and unaccusingly polite throughout the ordeal. It was pretty silly to begin with. I realize now this might happen more often than I'd think, and people are stupid and easy to accuse. Stabbing a kid with a pair of scissors. I tried to explain the kid was bullying and attempted to steal my scissors but cut himself on them in the process. Got suspended by the principal anyway because the school didn't want to take sides. I was 18 and home for my lunch break one day when 3 detectives showed up at my door. Apparently, our IP address had been used to post illegal material containing children to a website. Not knowing my rights adequately at the time, I let the cops in and let them inspect my computer. They found LimeWire on it and decided I was a suspect. By this time, I'd called both of my parents at least 10 times, but neither were picking up. I let them take my computer so they could have the lab do a more thorough inspection of my hard drive. Expectedly, they found nothing and either decided not to or were unable to get a warrant for the rest of the computers and digital storage devices in the house. The worst thing about the whole ordeal was my parents asking me repeatedly over the next week if I did it, and if I did, they'd get me help. That freaking hurt. I'm already freaking the frick out about cops taking my computer and digging through it, and now my parents think I'm guilty. They didn't seem to accept that I didn't do anything wrong until we got my computer back and we were no longer being investigated. My plan after the fact was to not tell anyone about what happened, because nobody needs to know that the cops came knocking on my door looking for someone distributing that kind of material. My dad decided to tell any of my friends who came over about what happened as a warning about security. Our Wi-Fi was unsecured until after this incident. Being 18-year-old dudes, they made it a running joke that I was into that stuff. They're still my friends because I know they weren't trying to actually be jerks, but those jokes still hurt. They actually mostly stopped after a couple of months, and I think the last time I heard one of them mention it was 2 years after the fact, 4 years ago. Oosh, I mean, there's a lot of accusations in this group about misbehavior with young people. I guess it's a good thing that people take the issues so seriously, but it looks like it can really wreck your life if untrue accusations come your way. My mum accused me of eating her candy bar when I was 8, even though my sister ate it. My sister was 10 and wouldn't fess up, so we had to stand in a corner for 6 hours until my dad came home and I started bawling and my sister finally told him she ate it. He yelled at my mum for punishing me. Love you, Dad. 6 hours for a candy bar? Jesus Christ. Yeah, my mum is serious about her chocolate, and she's a witch. My wife was arrested while out shopping with our 3-month-old. As she walked into the store, a girl who was exiting offered her a shopping cart. My wife accepted and went about her business. A few minutes later, the girl found her in the store and asked if she'd left her, the girl's, wallet in the cart. My wife said no and figured that was the end of it. Evidently after that, the girl went to store security who let her watch all the recorded security video and they saw my wife tucking something into her diaper bag right after accepting the cart. It was her phone, by the way. The girl ran back across the store screaming at my wife, "I know you did it! They have it on camera! I called the cops!" etc. So my wife keeps trying to de-escalate the situation, but the girl's having none of it. Then the store's customer service desk, where they ended up to discuss things, holds up the girl's wallet. "Is this yours?" The girl grabs it and confirms it's hers and departs without an apology. Then the cops show up and in their opinion, my wife stole the wallet and hid it in the store where someone else picked it up and turned it in. So they arrest her for felony theft. After trying to force her at length to confess, threatening our child, swearing at her, among other things, eventually she pulled out her camera to record them and that's when they shut up, cuffed her and charged her. It took us several months and a hefty lawyer fee to get access to the security video, which the cops weren't required to turn over to us until the day of her hearing. But once we had it, it only took 20 minutes to prove exactly what did happen with the wallet. It was dropped by the girl before she even offered the cart. Another customer picked it up and brought it to customer service before my wife even entered the store. 5 months, $3,500 later, the DA called it a case of mistaken identity and dropped charges. During that time, my wife couldn't apply for jobs. She's a mental health counselor and it would have shown up in her background check, and had to take several days away from our very young child, including being detained for over 4 hours for the arrest itself. No apology from the DA, the cops, the store, or the girl. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. When I was 18 years old, my cousin came over one day and brought me truck parts that he said he'd brought for my birthday and they'd finally arrived. I thanked him wholeheartedly because it must have been almost $1,000 in parts and I really needed them. I installed them all into my truck and went on my merry way. Fast forward about a month later and I'm cleaning my truck and 2 police cars roll up to my house. They read me my rights and explain to me that my cousin told them that I told him to steal a credit card and buy me truck parts, which is a screwing load of nonsense. I told them that I had no part involved with it, and that should be the end of it. But still, I did receive stolen products and still had to go to court for it. My cousin got a slap on the wrist and community service because he was 17, but since I was an adult, I had to be charged. I was able to get it down to only a misdemeanor and no jail time, again, all while I never did a single fricking thing. Dealt with it on my record for about 2 years and was able to get it expunged. F the American justice system. I was able to forgive him because I know we all make mistakes, but what really killed me is that his mother, my aunt, said I was a bad influence on him and I deserved it. That hurt me the most. The school district was hit by a virus. I think it was ransomware, although that doesn't match up chronologically, back in late 2007. Once they cleaned up the mess, they traced it back to someone with a flash drive in our computer lab, during the period our class was using them. My 5th grade teacher, who had it in for me, ranted me out in front of the class regarding my utter stupidity and carelessness. That hurt, although she'd done it before and would do it again. I wasn't to blame, however, as I'd lost my flash drive a couple of weeks before the virus incident, and ended up finding it a month or so in a small backpack pocket, completely soaking in a carton of soy milk I'd also forgotten. Oddly, no other consequences, which makes me think she was bullcrapping. I was accused of unwanted advances on a girl at a party at my university. I was drunk as heck that night, and so was my good friend who I was dancing with. This girl had a boyfriend who I knew of, so I wasn't even hitting on her, we were just drunk and dancing. Suddenly, one of the guards grabs me by the arm and kicks me out and tells me that one of the stage guards had called him due to me bothering this girl. I spoke to her the day after, and she had no idea what they were talking about. The worst part about this was I actually knew the guy who kicked me out. He told me to go grab something to eat at McDonald's and come back in an hour or two, since I was really drunk, which I can own up to. I assume he knew me well enough to know I would never do what I was accused of, but it still ruined that night. Back when my school's Twitter started posting raunchy SpongeBob memes, my teacher accused me of hacking into the Twitter account and doing it myself. He probably thought so because I've done sorta similar things before, but not to that extent, and nothing that could be considered hacking. They eventually figured out that the student responsible for running the account mixed up the school's account and one of her personal ones. The narrator has said dozens of times throughout his life that adult images of SpongeBob are no laughing matter, and feels vindicated by the previous story. Think before you Photoshop off those square pants, people. I was accused of stealing a puppy. This'll be long. My boyfriend, now husband, and I were home one Friday afternoon when our dog started barking incessantly, which is unusual for him. I go outside and there's a Labrador puppy playing around in our front yard. No one is around. I've lost a dog before and know how that feels, so the first thing I do is put him on a leash and walk him around our neighborhood to see if we run into anyone looking for him. No dice. It's getting late in the day and I have to start getting ready for work. I tie him out in our front yard so if anyone's looking for him, they can spot him and then call the animal shelter to report him found. But I don't initially bring him in. In 2009, I lost a blue heeler. While frantically searching for him in multiple counties, I emailed a lady who I thought was the current director of a local animal shelter. She had since left the position and was very candid with me about the shady things that sometimes go down in animal shelters. I'd heard some stories about possibly unethical practices being carried out at my own county shelter, and took her advice to heart. So I was wary of dropping this puppy off at this shelter even though I'd since moved to a different county. My boyfriend was sick that weekend and was not in the mood to watch this 4-month-old puppy in our unpuppy-proofed house. I didn't want to take him to the shelter. I felt confident that we could find the puppy's family, but I was scheduled to work the next 3 days and had very little say in the matter, since I wouldn't be able to actually watch the puppy. My boyfriend drove him to the shelter that evening. He signed a paper relinquishing the pup, but didn't get a copy. The next Friday, I have a voicemail from the owner of the puppy saying that the shelter had given her my number. She wants to pick her puppy up. What in the heck? I call her back and tell her that I'd found her puppy and alerted them that he'd been found and then taken in. She didn't believe me. Fast forward, she starts talking about legal action. She's accusing me of theft of her very expensive and well-bred Labrador. I didn't let on that I know labs and that she didn't have much of a pup from a confirmation standpoint, but I digress and not that it matters. I keep my cool. I've never so much as smoked a cigarette in my life, so I wasn't feeling very intimidated. So I'm at work again and I'm complaining to my coworkers about this predicament that I'm in. The shelter is acting like they've never heard from us. This woman filed a police report against me. I show my coworker a picture that I'd taken of the puppy. Her friend adopted it 3 days after it was turned in. So now I found the puppy twice. I call the original owners and I'm like, look, this is weird and I don't care if you believe me, but I found your freaking puppy again. The shelter adopted him out way before the standard stray hold had expired and without being altered. I connect her to the new adoptive owner who is crushed when he hears the backstory. The original owner goes to the shelter for answers about how this could have happened and decides to believe me when, due to the system being down, they can't show her any of the paperwork for the dog being relinquished or adopted out. She believes me now, but instead of all three of us, me, new owner, and old owner, going up there and exposing the lies once and for all, she wants to sue their butts off. She doesn't get her dog back for weeks because it's evidence or some crap, and I'm not supposed to confront the shelter until she says so. I have 2 lawyers in my family who say this suit won't go anywhere, and it doesn't, to my knowledge. I never got any closure. All I want for them is to look me in the eye and admit to throwing me under the bus. A day or 2 after the truth came out and the original dog owner had begun her crusade against the shelter, reporting them to the news, reporting them to the county commission, etc., the county dog warden creeped by my house at about 9 p.m. I'm instantly suspicious. Next night, same thing, but my dog and I are out for a walk on my street. The next morning I get a knock on my door from an official-looking man asking if the dog in the yard is mine. Apparently a dog that looked like him bit someone, but this guy is so nervous and he's stuttering that he can barely get the words out. I look him in the eye and tell him that my dog is never loose or out of my sight and to get off my porch. He said my dog matched the description they had. Well, the interesting thing is that my next-door neighbor has the exact same breed, same color and everything. Do you think they asked her if her dog had bit anyone? Negative. Same investigation. I'm glad I told him to get lost. After that, I took my dog for a vacation at my dad's farm. I'm convinced the shelter wanted some petty revenge. This was 4 years ago, but screw you, Dana and Mike. In 3rd grade, there was this one kid and we hated each other. One day, I get accused of calling him the N-word during recess. The only problem was, I was on the other side of the playground from him. Come lunchtime, the teacher pulls me aside and starts scolding me, and demanding that I apologize to him for calling him that. I refused to because I didn't, and I didn't even see him all day. She then gets on me for claiming he was lying, and it's wrong to accuse someone of lying, and that I had to apologize for both now. I refused and said I didn't say anything, and I refused to apologize for something I didn't do. Finally, she says if I didn't do it, to just apologize for it. I replied saying that if I apologized for doing something I didn't do, then it would look like I actually did it and be wrong. I refused, stood my ground, and got a week of lunchtime detention. Totally worth it. That sucks, although I'll be the first to admit that I'd have no idea what to do in a situation like that where you have no proof one way or the other as to who said what. I'm glad I'm not a teacher. Not sure which of my bad luck Brian stories to share here, so let's go with one of my personal favorites that had the biggest risk of jail time. It was about 10 to 15 years ago, and I'd recently graduated college and finally had the money to go and drink. Friends and I would go out and listen to cover bands and drink and have a good old time. However, because we weren't stupid, we would auto-rotate through the designated driver through the night. This night, it was my time to be said driver. I picked up the guys and we all go downtown and get into the parking garage. It's one of those take a ticket, gate opens, pay before you leave situations. We're at the bar, having a good old time, drinks are had, well, not by me, and many advances on women are rejected and we call it a night. Get to the car and go back to the gate and put in the ticket. Ticket spits back out, put in the ticket, ticket spits back out. I look over the ticket and it appears to be in working order, no major fold on said ticket and everything looks fine. I try this 4 or 5 more times before pressing the call button, but this just rings a phone and nothing happens. At this juncture, I'm livid. I just want to get the heck home. And this is a time before Uber and a town where taxi service is craptastic at best. Sure, I could walk 5 miles home, but I don't want to, so I try the ticket again. Finally, Chris has had enough. He gets out of my car and starts screaming obscenities till he's red in the face. He goes to the gate and just lifts it up. You can hear it break. At this point, nothing I can do but just drive on home. Well, those garages have cameras. Those cameras look at the license plates, and those license plates tie back to your name. So imagine my shock when I get a call from the police department the next day saying they want to question me regarding property damage in excess of some crazy number. Well, in the end, Chris admitted he did it. He had to pay for the repairs and do some community service. But man, that sucked. What's the most spectacular way you've seen someone screw up at work? A grad student was invited into a professor's office for a meeting and was left alone for a moment. There was a pile of cumulative exams on the professor's desk that had just been graded. These are subject exams for grad students. Wickedly difficult, and you need to pass 4 to continue in the program. This moron decided he'd take a look at the stack of exams, then upon finding that some of his fellow students did poorly, he took pictures of their grades so he could use them to ridicule them and pass the results around the department. This was a big deal because numerical grades aren't ever given out for these exams, only pass and fail. And also, it's a pretty big FERPA violation to distribute others' personal academic information like that. FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. He was found out almost as soon as he sent the pics around and was dismissed and forbidden from campus immediately. Someone else had to pack up his desk because they were that serious about him never setting foot in the building again. Good frickin' riddance. I'm so thankful none of my classmates in my grad program were this petty and cruel. It's hard enough with everyone being supportive and awesome. The sheer idiocy of that dude is breathtaking. A co-worker received a promotion and a large raise. They were told they should thank the CEO as he initiated the entire promotion. My co-worker went on a rant about not asking for any of it, so he's not thanking anyone, and it escalated from there. By the end of the day, he was fired. My coworker actually turned a promotion into a termination. One of my coworkers at a grocery store accidentally locked the only master key set into the security office, then attempted to break the door down with a claw hammer before anyone could find out. 10 minutes of furious attacking only succeeded in attracting the attention of everyone in the store, breaking off the handle and bending the entire lock, making it inoperable by the locksmith brought in later. Guy drops a glove in the deep fryer, sticks his entire hand in before realizing it's on and set to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Oops, I dropped the thing that's meant to protect my hand in that hot oil. Better stick my hand into said hot oil to fish it out. Oh no, there's hot oil on my hand. Who could have foreseen this turn of events? The author continues with another story. My current job is a lab technician at a major university, and we had a new guy unplug the small -80 degrees Celsius freezer full of recombinant DNA because he wanted to charge his phone. Ugh, yikes. I remember when I worked as a lab tech and another tech overfilled some of the wells in our stock DNA sample tray, contaminating all of the other wells. Then she just wiped off the excess and didn't tell anybody. Not only did we have to travel several hours to another university to get new DNA samples, but we had to throw out several weeks' worth of work since we'd unknowingly been using contaminated samples. I was once a bank teller. One day, a guy comes in to pay off a line of credit that he shares with his son. Apparently, his son is a substance addict and ran a line of credit up to $10,000, maxing it out. The guy comes in, talks to my fellow teller, pays it off, and signs to close it out. He asked my coworker at least 3 times that it was closed. She assures him that it is. She's also addicted to her phone and loans most of her attention to it, by the way. The guy leaves. Several months later, the same guy comes in enraged with a line of credit bill. He comes to my window and explains the situation. He thought it was closed. It turns out that our bank's policy, not sure if this is universal, is that both he and his son have to sign off to close it out, unless there's some sort of special circumstance that never happened. The guy owed another $10,000 because of course his son isn't going to sign off on closing it out if he can run up the balance again. Dad says he's going to sue. I point him in the direction of someone more qualified than me. My manager tells me he has a good case and will probably beat out our corporate bank in court. I'm just a teller. Some days it's good to be on the bottom. Glad it wasn't me that messed it up. I work at a call center. I reviewed a call where the guy thought the phone was muted and called the customer a stupid moron. The customer called him out and he tried to backpedal and make up some story. He was fired shortly after. When I worked at a call center, this was a regular occurrence. I used to work at Popeyes, this fried chicken chain. It sucked and I eventually quit. A week after I quit, the night crew decided they didn't feel like putting the boxes away from a truck shipment. Someone could deal with it next day. Few days later, and several reports of food poisoning later, they got in a load of trouble. Boxes were full of raw chicken. I'm so glad that I quit. A couple of years ago, we had a new supervisor directly from corporate. He got a promotion and moved from another city. He was a complete jerk, micromanagement nightmare, arrogant, a few other things. But someone up in the corporate ladder really liked the guy, so he had full support from the bosses. Then in his first month of work, his company car was stolen. It was insured, so no big deal. A week later, his replacement car was stolen again, and a third car 2 weeks later. Turns out the guy had trouble with alcohol, and he got really drunk and left the car open on the street and just forgot about it. He wasn't fired, he was just moved to a desk job with no company car. I used to work in a grocery store, and I had an HR person repeatedly lose my doctor's note stating that I have Raynaud's syndrome and couldn't be in the freezer. I got a stack of them from the doc and would have to bring in a new one every few weeks. Finally, I had a department head fax a copy into corporate for me before dropping off yet another copy to the HR witch. The next week, the HR witch called me into her office and told me I was going to have to put the frozen load for bakery away. I told her I couldn't do it and I had a note on file. She told me she didn't have any paperwork on file for me and that she could make me do anything she wanted. I called my department manager into my office and told him what she had said. I got corporate on the phone and asked if they had received a copy of my doctor's note detailing the fact that I had Raynaud's syndrome and had already previously gotten frostbite at work from being forced to be in the freezer when I wasn't supposed to be. He said they had it and he then told them what HR Witch had said. He then handed HR Witch the phone. She had to hold the phone about 1.5 feet away from her face because they were yelling at her so loud. It was one of the most satisfying days ever working there. She went on leave shortly after that and never came back, and the official story was that she was having health problems. A substitute came into work completely hammered once. The job started at 8 and he drove there drunk. I get that junior high is stressful, but drink afterwards. That's not a great endorsement of the school he worked at the day before. One time, this complete moron I worked with in the shipyards, a pipe welder, was torching a pipe next to lagging, which is what helps insulate Navy ships. Instead of taking 5 minutes at most to use a blade to remove said lagging, the moron welded the pipe and torched the lagging. It doesn't burst into flames, but there was a lot of smoke and ended up getting the ship evacuated. He got fired 2 weeks later while his write-up was pending, because he put a ladder in the middle of a passageway, which are extremely tight when you consider the heavy equipment moving through. When he was asked to move, the welder told the person asking to F off. And when you tell that to the shipyard director, well, you tend to get fired. Worked in a single-story cinder block office with parking spaces out front. There was a big window that overlooked the parking lot. We had an older engineer, early 70s, that worked there. He pulled up one morning in his parking spot and must have gotten the brakes and the gas confused. He drove the car right through the window, taking out some of the wall with it. I can still remember seeing him gripping the steering wheel with this terrified look in his eyes while he kept slamming on the gas. The car must have gotten stuck on something because it would just lurch forward and the engine would rev. Luckily, he didn't kill anyone. He retired soon after that. It's actually a pretty common human error problem. People get the pedals switched in their head, and then panic causes them to lock their foot on the brake. We're fallible creatures. The narrator has fallen prey to this very problem before while riding a moped for the first time. It's amazing how long your brain can panic lock itself into holding onto the mechanical switch that does the opposite of what you need it to do. My coworker sold someone an auto insurance policy but forgot to check the effective date. Turns out she had pushed the start date of the policy out a month. Guy got into an accident a few days later. Cumulatively, we probably spent more than 10 hours on the phone trying to get claims to cover this guy's accident. She ended up messing up the effective date on about 10 other policies before she left. I work at a group home for people with mental and physical disabilities. Most of the residents can't walk or even stand on their own, so staff will help them stand or hold on to them while they walk so they don't fall over. Well, I had one coworker that was stupid. For multiple reasons, but this one takes the cake. She helped one of the residents stand up to use the restroom, had her put her hands on the handlebar attached to the bathroom, similar to the bathroom stall, and left to get things that the resident needed to take a shower. She left her standing there alone for a solid 3 or 4 minutes. Of course, the resident fell and hit her head pretty good. Had to go to the hospital and get stitches. She ended up being fine afterwards. How on earth my coworker wasn't fired is completely beyond me. I'm a welfare caseworker. A few months ago, I got a call from a client wondering what was going on with her case. Read the case comments and found out that one of my more intellectual coworkers shut down this case and assessed a 5-year overpayment on this client for her cash aid, basically saying that all the aid she'd ever received was fraudulent and she needed to pay it all back. Her reasoning? There was a glitch in the system that made this woman's child show as a resident in a different country. Rather than following established protocol and calling this woman, or ordering a fraud investigation from our literal unit of full-time investigators, or anything else that would make sense, she went out of her way to make this woman's life hard. For the record, I called the other county and the worker I spoke with confirmed that the child was no longer a resident. His father had reported to them that the family was moving to our county 5 years ago, and they'd been trying, unsuccessfully, to update his county residence ever since. Because I caught the phone call, I had to unscrew the case and close out the overpayment. I work with preemies in a neonatal ICU. We get morphine in a multi-dose syringe that's good for 24 hours. We generally give doses for it every 4 hours. Every time we dose, we have to chart the amount in the electronic medical record, calculate a safe dose, draw it up, show it to another nurse along with the calculations, scan it, there's a million safety checks. A nurse did exactly none of these things and gave the whole syringe to the baby. Then she ordered another and did it again in 4 hours. And then she did it again 4 hours later. The baby got more than 3 days' worth of morphine in 12 hours. He had to be put on a breathing machine. Somehow, she did not get fired. There was a nursing shortage in Pennsylvania at the time. Sort of a similar situation. I worked in a blood bank and we sent some blood to the floor for a nurse to transfuse into a specific patient. Different nurse picked it up, doesn't look at the label, doesn't look at the patient name, doesn't do any of the 3 electronic checks and sticks it into a patient. Transfused the whole bag and then decides to let us know she made a simple mistake. No big deal. Okay, thanks, bye. Thank God the blood type matched, or she would have killed that patient. We're freaking out and filing reports to managers and the FDA. She gets a slap on the wrist and is transfusing the same patient later that day. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. This one time I worked at a company who made shelter cloth, like for orchards. It was woven from plastic thread. There were these huge banks of needles that just ran and ran, making these giant rolls of cloth. The night shift guy was pretty new, and the night shift was just him and the machine. It would take most of the shift to do a full roll with a setup and takedown. The lunchroom was soundproofed because the production floor was pretty noisy. So the night shift guy basically just had to babysit the weaver all night and then change the rollout and set up for day shift. I came in early one morning because I wanted to pick up some gear I'd left in my locker, and I walk into the unholiest nightmare you've ever seen. A Gordian knot at least 30 foot high. The guy had sat there until like 2 a.m., the darkest part of the night. Then he decided to smoke some Mary J in the lunchroom and had fallen asleep. He woke up hours later to the sound of the weaver smashing itself to pieces. One of the needle banks had moved during the night and he hadn't seen the warning indicator. So then it had worked its way loose, then snapped, then flipped over and snapped the one next to it. Then it had made hundreds and hundreds of meters of messed up Frankenstein cloth with the giant kilometer-long thread bunches. I walked in to him screaming. He had woken up 15 minutes prior and had not got past freaking out. I could think clearer than him, so I went and got the big forklift and pulled this huge bird's nest off of the needle banks and slammed them in, and likewise hid the busted up ones in the dumpster. Then we started feeding in the new roll and just got the machine going again when the day shift came in. They were surprised that the night guy had got through the overnight materials so fast, but since it happened sometimes when the machine behaved, they didn't make a big deal. I went back to uni about 2 months later and never found out if the story continued. But the crazed look of the night shift guy screaming and holding his chest has stayed with me for 30 years. I can't imagine how much stress he was under, being brand new at a job and thinking that you had not only lost your job, but also completely wrecked the machine, a ton of material, and maybe been open to legal action might completely freak a person out. In 2009, we had some layoffs, like a lot of businesses, and one of those let go was a mechanic. Since most of the mechanics bring in a lot of their own toolboxes when one leaves the company, they'll need to load up their box. The screw-up was that the supervisor of the shop that day didn't pay attention or stick around while the mechanic was loading his box. The mechanic not only loaded up his box, he helped himself to several company-owned pieces of equipment, totaling $18,000 in value. But because the supervisor wasn't doing his job, there was no proof that the mechanic took those items. This is the same supervisor who didn't notice when a huge spool of copper wire somehow rolled itself out of the building. Said supervisor no longer works here either. New coworker on her first day went to get coffee from the break room, was walking back to it when she just barely stumbled a little bit, just enough that some hot coffee dripped over the edges of the cup and burnt her fingers. So she reactively flung her hand and released the mug, causing lots of hot coffee to go all over the walls just outside the boss's office. She literally just stared frozen at the coffee-drenched wall and said, "Oh, geez." We gave her heck for it for about a year in a joking way. She actually proved to be a fantastic coworker. Used to deliver pizzas. Our dumb idiot manager that lived in a hotel and effed everything that moved contracted hepatitis A, but told no one and still came into work. After a few days, he began looking like an overweight banana and was complaining of all the classic symptoms. He was told to go home by corporate while we had to deep clean the store and throw away all of the ingredients due to possible contamination. In the middle of us cleaning, he decides to waltz in with what we think might be a working girl because he forgot his jacket. I was so dumbfounded that he would do this in front of one of the 2 bigwigs that were monitoring us. He was fired on the spot. 2 days after that, and our restaurant made the local news when a few people began to claim that they'd contracted Hep A from our pizza. There was a Hep A outbreak in our community at the time, so whether that was true or not, I'll never know. Sales suffered, and it took the store almost a year to recover. Let me tell you about Joe. Joe was hired as an entry-level developer. He started on a Monday. Every Tuesday, our team had a meeting in the first-floor conference room. Meeting time rolls around. No Joe. We wait. After a couple of minutes, I walk over to his cube. Not there. Check his break room. Nope. Stick my head in the men's room. Empty. Screw it. Go back to the meeting and tell my boss I have no idea. Maybe he forgot and was still at lunch. We start the meeting. A few minutes later, Joe walks in, about 15 minutes late. He apologizes and says he's been downstairs looking for the first floor meeting rooms. Yes, he was wandering around the fricking basement looking for the first floor meeting room. This was an omen of things to come. He was constantly falling asleep at his desk. He called out sick about 12 times in his first month. My boss finally told him one morning that they needed to have a talk. He had meetings most of the morning, so he told Joe to stop by his office around 11:30. Joe doesn't show up. Boss waits, and finally at 12 we go to get lunch. While we're gone, Joe comes in, gets all of his personal belongings from his desk and disappears. Never heard from him again. Now, whenever a newbie makes a mistake and is apologizing for it, we say, well, at least you know where the first floor is. I'm a cashier in a pharmacy. Anyone that works in the medical field knows that patient privacy is super important. When a patient picks up their prescription, we have to scan the receipt of their medication to the computer. This is unique to each individual prescription, so if it doesn't match, we accidentally grabbed someone else's medication. It catches mistakes before we make them. The alternative to scanning is typing the RX number into the computer. This doesn't guarantee a match. Only comparing the number on the receipt with the number on the computer will work if the barcode won't work. One day, while I was on break, someone came in looking for a prescription. The girl covering my post clearly confirmed the date of birth, but grabbed someone else's prescription by mistake. Two people with the same last name were next to each other in the fridge. But she didn't scan the receipt, so her mistake was not caught. She typed the number she saw on the computer, had the person sign for their medication, and gave them someone else's medication. Not 20 minutes later, the patient calls and tells us what he received was not intended for him. We, of course, apologized, and he came back to get his medication. The sad thing is, once something leaves the store, it can't be returned. We can dispose of it, but we can't use it for someone else, even if it's still sealed. This particular medication cost $4,000, and we had to throw it out. This, plus the breach of privacy, didn't stand well, and she was written up for her mistake. She doesn't use cash much anymore and is confined to packaging. Ouchies. Accidentally wasting medication to the tune of a very generous monthly salary is one heck of a thing for a manager to hang over your head for the remainder of your employment there. One of the cops on a base I was stationed at ran his vehicle right into the wing of a jet. He then decided to throw the light bar that had been sheared off into a random dumpster like it had never happened. That idiot was caught immediately. This literally happened last Thursday. New teacher at the daycare, working in the baby room. Here's her list of what made everyone dislike her. 1. She told many aides she didn't like babies while working in the baby room. 2. She refused to change diapers, burp the babies, or even feed them in high chairs. 3. She just sat in the same chair and refused to do anything at all. 4. She wouldn't train new aides or help them in the room. And 5. She didn't care about bonding with the children or even her co-workers. But her biggest mess-up was that she let a baby roll off the changing table. According to my co-workers, she simply walked away from this child and left him there, and he rolled off and hit the floor. Apparently, she has a history of this, where other teachers and aides had to be like, "What the frick? Watch the baby and keep a hand on them at all times on the changing table." The only reason she took the job was because, and I quote, "Daddy won't give me spending money with my graduation present, so I'm just going to do this until July and then quit." Her grad present was a 2-week trip to Hawaii. She got fired for negligence, so good riddance. The baby is fine and the parents aren't suing or anything, and I can only think this is because the other teacher, who was feeding the new infant, was there, and they trust her heavily, and know she'd never put their son directly in harm's way. Good riddance. Worked at Arby's in 2016. It's approaching 10 p.m. and everybody working really wants to go home. A guy making sandwiches accidentally gets some bread stuck in the toaster oven. For some reason, he uses a knife with a plastic handle to try and get it out. The knife gets stuck, so he uses a second knife to get the first knife and bread out. That knife gets stuck, and he uses a third knife to get the other 2 knives and the bread out. Now all the knives are stuck in the toaster oven, and the plastic handle starts to melt. In short, step-by-step guide to getting the toaster oven at Arby's replaced. Someone I worked with at a Toyota dealership didn't rack an SUV right on the lift, and it fell off. It really did way less damage than I thought, but he was fired on the spot. When I worked at Home Depot, a co-worker who worked in lumber crashed the forklift into a car and messed it up pretty bad. Weapon shop owners. What crazy reasons have you had to refuse a person a sale? This lady was telling my brother, the owner of the shop, that she needed something more effective because the arrows she had been shooting weren't sinking the canoes and kayaks of people floating down the river in her backyard. They wanted to look at a piece up close. I took it out to let him see it, and he pointed it right at my face. Wasn't at the shop per se, but at the range inside the shop. I'd bought a .45 that I wanted to run a few rounds through and did just that. As I was leaving the booth and heading to the exit, an older gentleman tapped me on the arm and asked for help. I didn't work at this establishment, and compared to many, I don't have a ton of experience, but I have a pretty freaking solid understanding of safety with these devices. That being said, I stopped and asked him what he needed. He stated that he was having trouble with his weapon, which was on the bench in the booth, and that he couldn't get it to fire, even though the safety was off. As I was responding with the usual, "Do you have a round chambered?" he just picked it up, pointed it at himself, and pulled the trigger. By some sick divine intervention, it didn't fire. I slowly and firmly removed it from his hands and brought it back to said bench, where I removed the magazine and discharged a very live round. It took all of half a second to see that the safety was sitting in a cool, half-on, half-off position, and that he was scooting by on sheer dumb luck. I placed the device back on the bench, asked him to wait a minute, and walked out the doorway to the front desk. Before I could open my mouth, the range officer was walking around to give the guy a piece of his mind. In Texas, I was standing at my kitchen sink doing the dishes in a third-floor apartment one day, looking out the window. Directly across, the guy on 3 had come out with a piece and was cleaning it on a table. I looked away, and when I looked back, the family on 2 had let their toddler out on the patio with a toy. I watched in slow motion as this guy let go of the slide and aimed the piece at the ground, through the floor where the toddler was playing below, and fired a live round into the patio cement. As I was just out the door, I saw the kid's dad grab him and sweep him inside, but I've never been down and up 3 flights of stairs so quickly. In retrospect, it was stupid not to grab my own piece, and at least my phone, but Captain Intelligence on 3 wasn't hostile, just stupid. He was still holding the piece and shaking it when he answered the door. The kid was unhurt, but my faith in people's ability to safely exercise their rights may never recover. Meanwhile in Texas should be a subreddit by itself. The narrator is not mentally ready for the Meanwhile in Texas subreddit, and our viewers are certainly not ready for a 20-minute video of him attempting that accent. Other than the few who were drunk or high, one that sticks out was the guy who asked for the cheapest gat, not so unusual, and only 1 bullet. After he noticed my reaction, he backpedaled and turned it into a joke. I obviously was still uncomfortable and looped my manager in. We ran the background check and told him it had been delayed and that he could come back tomorrow while we figured out what else we could do. He left without incident but then sat in his car in the parking lot for a long time. The manager decided contacting the police was the best route at the time. Not sure what happened afterwards, but he did not come back. Dude, we sell them in boxes of 20 minimum. How much more obvious can you be? Oh boy, I've turned down sales for simple things like mishandling the weapon and pointing it at people, for saying they were buying it for their husband 15 minutes after he was rejected on the InstaCheck system, but the one that took the cake was late one night, after selling hours anyways. I was closing down my department and this young couple came up to the counter. The guy was roughed up and bleeding from multiple cuts on his head. Nothing too bad, but still alarming. The girl he was with walked him up and said, "We need a piece." Rather than just say, "Sorry, it's after hours," I instead said, "Alright, which one?" She looked at the display cases and said, "I need one that will hurt someone." I just looked at her for a second, incredulous that she was that stupid. I said, "Well, they can all hurt someone." And she pointed at a Mossberg 22 and said, "What about that one?" And I said, "Yeah, that could hurt someone if it was used the wrong way." And she points at the Winchester. "What about that one?" I said, "That one is definitely dangerous." She said she'd take it, and that's when I said no. Sorry, it's past hours, and I just didn't trust her or him with a piece right now, because he obviously just got his butt kicked. She started yelling at me, and I said, "Alright, I think it's time to call the cops," and picked up the phone. That's when they said F off and left. It was pretty funny, actually. The place I teach has had a few interesting ones. I saw a customer's probation officer's card in their wallet. The owner of the shop knew the probation officer and called and asked if their client was allowed to have a weapon. The answer, surprisingly, was no. There was a lady with symptoms of being homeless who came in looking for a small piece. and while furiously dry-firing a pocket 22 says, "It's not to kill someone, but like to teach them a lesson." Lots and lots of confused people thinking that one of these things can be in their spouse's or girlfriend's name or whatever, like a car loan. It's okay if she does the paperwork, right? No, it's not. The person buying the piece has to do the paperwork. My state also has legal, medicinal, and recreational green herb use. The owner doesn't care unless you make him care, but other places, if they see your medicinal card, they don't mess around. But they still have people who come in obviously reeking of Mary Jane, since we're between two dispensaries, and the owner will be like, "Come on, you wouldn't try to mess with a piece drunk, would you?" I don't work for a specialist shop, but I was involved with a pawn shop when it went down. A neighbor had dementia and lived alone. His son was a piece of crap and randomly got him caretakers who were seriously messed up individuals. Think cops outside at 3 a.m. saying the caretaker was asking for a ride at 6 a.m. on a Sunday, high as a kite. Apparently, my neighbor owned a pair of weapons. His caretaker would pawn them monthly to buy substances and buy them back later when the neighbor's social security came in. I didn't know this, but what I did know is the caretaker was a felon, and he's not allowed to live in a house with that kind of ordinance lying around. It turned out they smelled something funny going on finally at the pawn shop when this guy, high as frick, eased this old man into the shop to sell his pieces every month. They wanted someone to co-sign for him, so he asks, reasoning that since I'm a good fellow and I work for the police department, I wouldn't have a problem with this. That I wouldn't have a problem with a felon and an elderly man with dementia buying weapons every month to store in the house. What a fricking crap show. I spoke to the manager, who went and got the store owner, who asked me to repeat the story. Thank the Lord they reported it and turned the weapons over to the cops. I'm not a clerk at one of those shops, but I've had to refuse several private sales for sketchy behavior. When people gripe about wanting to see an in-state ID or a carry permit, that's a pretty good indicator they aren't legally allowed to possess a dangerous weapon. I had one guy text me pictures of his automatic collection as proof that he had a Class 3, and therefore I wouldn't be violating the law by selling to an out-of-state buyer. He vehemently refused to meet at a federal licensing place to do the transfer, even when I offered to pay for it. Yeah, okay dude, you're clearly a felon and also your full auto-suppressed MP5 is actually a 22 with a fake can. I worked at Turner's Outdoorsman in Reseda during the early 2000s. One time a family came in, mother, father, and 13-year-old son. They wanted to buy a shotty for home protection. Okay, no problem. The issue was that they kept taking the countersample firearms and way overdoing it on racking them. The 13-year-old had obviously seen Terminator a few times and was racking the side like the woman in the movie did in the film, one-handed and really hard. That's not good for the equipment. I have to tell him to stop. The father got indignant, so I asked him to leave. I was in my early 20s, a blonde white girl, and they didn't like that. I had to get my manager to finally make them leave. I ran a weapons store and a pawn shop for 5 years. I advertised a lot of the inventory online on Facebook when that was still allowed. I had one guy ask every question imaginable about a high point, $100, a piece of garbage in my opinion. Then when he showed up, his girlfriend wanted to purchase it. That's gonna be a no from me, dog. I don't do straw purchases. Happened a lot. Guys would come in, ask about a weapon and negotiate a price, then try to send their wife or girlfriend up for the 4473. I feel good about every sale I ever denied. I only regret one sale. The piece in question was used by the gentleman to self-delete. A well-known local teacher you would never have known. Man spends 30 minutes pawning a high point, leaves without buying. 10 minutes later, strung-out-looking girl comes in, looks at her hand and goes, "Hello, I would like to buy a high point C9 in 9mm caliber with a high-capacity magazine, please." Classic. At least once a month in my store. That's incredibly concerning. Also, if it wasn't obvious, we have to use slightly more obscure words to refer to the projectile-firing descendants of old black powder weapons to get past certain limitations on this platform. But hopefully you've grasped the subject matter if you've made it this far. Just a noob question here from someone who doesn't know a lot. When you join the US Army, do they just forgo the background check, or is that part of your general background check for the forces? No. Been in the Army 13 years and have 6 weapons. The background check applies to everyone. You'll be denied a sale if you have a dishonorable discharge. At a second-hand shop, I was talking with the guy at the counter, and a dude walked in wearing full-on paramilitary, kinda school shootout garb, and a mask with a long arm slung on his back, and a smaller piece in his hand, loaded with the hammer back held out to the side, with his finger on the trigger, and he yelled if someone could help him. Obviously, me and the clerk both pull out our weapons and point them at this idiot and tell him to put it down. I'm looking around to see if there's anyone else around. People are freaking out in the parking lot because they see I have a piece, and I tell them to call the police. Turns out this inbred idiot had just come back from playing airsoft and wanted to sell a weapon he bought off the street. I'm not a shop owner. I was in a store when the following happened that made me go, how freaking stupid can you be? A guy came in to buy a weapon, begins to fill out NICS, checked yes on 11B, are you under felony indictment, and got denied. He said, well, I'm out on bail, so I should be able to have a weapon. The clerk asked what for. Domestic. Checked no on H. Do you have an order of protection against you? The clerk says he's going to call NICS to file an appeal. The clerk calls the police. The police arrive. The idiot is arrested and goes back to jail with new charges, including lying on Form 4473. I know criminals are dumb, but come on, man. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I sold the items in question in a sporting goods store. A guy comes in and was looking at our selection. He claimed he was a former CIA assassin. Sure, whatever. He picked up a weapon, cocked it, and pointed it at me and pulled the trigger. I put it back and told him he was not buying anything from me or anyone else in this department. He looked at me and said, I'll be back for you. I called over one of my colleagues who was an off-duty cop that worked there part-time and told him what had happened. He flashed his badge and told the guy to leave the store and to not come back. The man left, cussing up a storm, and I never saw him again. When I'm reading this, I'm just imagining the customer as a really edgy teen. A lady came into my store and wanted to buy a Ruger 10-22, but when she told me which one she wanted, she just said, the black one. Fine, I don't care if she doesn't know the name, and I thought, what a perfect opportunity to upsell her on some training that we offered. Well, I got out the old form and walked her through my generic spiel, noting specifically, if you have no middle name, please put NMN in the box for middle name, not just NA. Just write NMN for no middle name. Attempt 1, the lady puts a big X through the box for middle name. I calmly explain it to her again and get her a new form. She puts NA in the box. I look at her questioningly and ask if she has a middle name, to which she responds no. I start to explain the process to her for a third time when she gets livid, picks up the 4473 form and rips it in half, and calls me a racist white boy cracker, who is being difficult over a stipularity. I think it was a cross between stipulation and technicality. I looked at her plainly and said, well, if you can't fill out the form, you can't buy the weapon. The sale is denied. After some more heated words sent my way, she was escorted out by the owner, who was watching the whole thing and listening from the back office 10 feet away. I denied a sale when someone admitted that they'd shot a bear at a state park out of season, poaching, and another time when someone pretty much told me they were going to use the item to kill a guy in Alabama. I also stopped numerous straw purchases. Most of the time, people didn't understand that it wasn't legal. The number of people who would absolutely lose their minds when I would have to walk them out the front door before I could give them their weapon was crazy. It was just store policy, but sometimes it would make the most normal weapon buyer turn nuts. There was this one guy who would come in about once a week with a new person each time. They'd be buying a weapon for themselves, but they didn't know anything about weapons. At first, I thought the guy was just helping friends pick one out, but after a while, he winked at me and said, "See you at the revolution." Cult leader? Anti-government? Who knows? I soon after left that job and never saw him again, but it sure left me with stories. As much as I'm sure all of our viewers from the States will enjoy hearing this from a person with a British-ish voice, there really needs to be a better form of control than just filling out a simple form, even though that basic task does seem to elude some of these morons. I was at my local store for these items, just chatting after picking a few things up. Another guy comes in looking for suppressors, says he's interested in one, to which the clerk starts explaining the tax stamp paperwork. In my state, you can own NFA items no problem. You don't get jammed up, but still go through the ATF process. The guy digests it all, says that's fine, understands the $200 tax, etc. The guy says something along the lines of, okay, I'll fill everything out and then come pick it up later this afternoon. To which the employee laughs, thinking he's joking, because if you've ever been through the process, the wait time is on average 9 months to a year. Personally, the fastest I've had an item processed is 7 months, but every other one has been at least 9. So the store employee was obviously thinking he's joking. The guy was dead serious and that he thought he could pick it up that afternoon. He got really irate and started cussing the employee out, and said, "If you're not willing to give it to me today, why do you even display them?" Then came a few racial slurs. The employee helping him was Hispanic, and as the rest of the employees came over to escort him out, he said something like, "Y'all wait until I raise hell with the Better Business Bureau," and then a few more racial slurs before he was physically escorted out. The other one was told me by a friend who works at a different store. The guy comes in wanting to buy a piece, and when handed the paperwork he says, "Oh, I didn't think there were background checks in this state," and leaves. Not long after all this, a patron who had just left the range comes back in letting them know that as soon as he got to his car, some guy came up asking if he'd sell one of his pieces for cash, no questions asked. The guy was just walking around the parking lot asking people if they would sell him one. When the police came and arrested him, he actually yelled, "But I was told anyone can buy guns in this state without ID." That was his actual response to the police. Apparently he had warrants in California and a bunch of missed court appearances. Another one was relayed to me from a friend who was at an auction house bidding on some weapons. Up for auction, there was a double-rune Mauser, which symbolized the rifle was likely used or issued by German special forces in World War II. They tend to sell for a very high premium. Some guy who got outbid tried to cause a scene about how these weapons should stay with the race and not go to those people, still arguing about it as the police arrested him after refusing to leave. Used to work at a specialist store and law enforcement supply. I saw a lot of stupid things, cops almost discharging their duty weapon, etc., even had a couple of holes in the ceiling from before I started. But the craziest reason I've denied someone was arguably the dumbest. Not dumb in the way some of the others have posted. I had plenty of denials for attempted straw purchase. So this frequent customer decides to bring his dad in one day to get a new piece to carry. Spend about 30 minutes helping him pick out a good one and a nice holster to go with it. He filled out the background check form and I'm getting ready to call it in when I noticed something odd. In the section where you select your ethnicity, he had drawn his own checkbox and wrote, Native Mexican American. I informed him that he wasn't allowed to do that and he just needed to do as the instructions stated. Select the box that matched his ethnicity the closest, i.e. Latino. He just could not be convinced to select a meaningless box on a form that the info didn't even get reported on. I had to deny the sale. I half wonder if he was just crazy or if he was an agent testing me with something stupid. A guy with SS Thunderbolts on his neck. I didn't even show him his piece he sent for the transfer, just told him to get out and I sent the weapon back. There was also a crazy lady who during the paperwork said it was for protection from the Mexicans in her basement that snuck up in the night to get her. I told her she was delayed and called the police. In case you're wondering, this is Tucson, Arizona, where there are almost no basements. And finally, a lady who came in asking for a particular model. We showed it to her. I asked her questions about ammo as she was smaller and it was a large weapon. She kept checking her phone and said this is the one she wanted even though she didn't know the caliber or the first thing about these kinds of weapons. I put 2 and 2 together, I explained what a straw purchase is and told her to leave. A customer came in and picked out a weapon, did the 4473 and failed the NICS check, tried to get us to sell it to his girlfriend instead. That's a big no. I sell at weapon shows with my buddy who has an FFL, and these young kids, they had to be about 13 years old, came up with a stack of cash, around $2,000, and they wanted to buy 4 AKs, so I asked them for ID as I pulled out the 4473s, because I've seen older guys that look young as heck as well. I told them that each AK is $700 and they said, wait, what are those papers? So I asked them how old they were and they said 18, but didn't want to fill out the paperwork because they want to take them to Mexico. I told my buddy to go call the cops and they left as quickly as they could. I had a woman buy 10,000 rounds of .22 long round and tried to buy 2 Ruger 10-22 rifles and a Smith & Wesson MP15. And she filled out her 4473 and I called it in and she got delayed. The FBI can delay the sale or pickup for 5 days in North Carolina if the person needs an investigation on their background. I'm still waiting for a reply, and she comes back the next day to ask if felons can buy weapons. and that she hopes they could because she was tired of seeing the zombies eat people in her yard and highway and crap. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe that she didn't instantly get denied when I called the day before. If she just admitted to this crazy crap, I manage a second-hand shop in North Carolina for those wondering. Customer here. I once saw a guy claiming to be a veteran throw a tantrum about how he misunderstood the waiting period and apparently failed to file proper DROS paperwork, so his waiting period had to restart. The whole room got quiet and I was pretty sure he was seconds away from being denied and getting escorted out until he came to his senses and filed the correct documents. Good lord! Can you withhold sales from someone who nearly flies off the handlebars like this? Part of me is wishing you could, although I suppose it would be hard to justify. I was at a store once when the owner, Gunther, prevented two people from buying big automatic pieces. One of them was institutionalized for setting her roommate on fire, and the other one was wanted for questioning in many felonious assaults. In the store I worked at, I was hit with a wall of alcoholic stench from 5 feet away. He couldn't even spell his own name right on the background check and expected me to fill it out. He didn't have a form of ID. He wanted the cheapest piece we had. It was all around just a bad experience. My friend used to work as a security guard at the local psych hospital, but because of the laws, he can't state specifically why he's denying each person. When he sees people who he knew were admitted for mania with homicidal ideation, he would just tell his boss, the owner, that he was refusing the sale and knew the customer from prior work experience. His boss knows how to read between the lines on that, and fortunately, federal law supports their right as a shop to refuse to sell a weapon to anyone provided that the reason isn't because of their race, ethnicity, or other federally protected discrimination statuses. I've seen people get refused for stupid reasons, like outright saying that they're buying it for someone else. Not an owner, just a law here in Australia I learned about recently. If you've had a restraining order placed against you, which can be applied for anyone even without proof of any danger, in the last 10 years, then you're ineligible to own, use, or buy a gun. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.